Well, you're going to have to be willing to do two things. You're going to have to be willing to lie, and you're going to have to be willing to kill without hesitation. And if you don't think you can do those things, then this is not for you. There was an FBI memo from 1949, 2 years after the CIA was created, 4 years before MKUltra technically exists. What they were looking for are ways in which you could use this to wipe out memories from people's minds and replace them or add false memories.
Wasn't this with the schizophrenic patients where they put them in a coma?
It's a psychic lobotomy, and you do these things in mental institutions because who's going to listen to anybody that complains?
In your opinion, was Epstein an intelligence construct?
Well, could the Mossad have been behind it? Well, okay. We would talk about governments and intelligence agencies, but are there entities that exist beyond that?
Such as?
You're talking about getting compromising information on very important, very powerful people who are more important and powerful than they are. Who would be willing to blackmail them and compromise them and potentially destroy them? Who is it who doesn't think that they can be touched by the same sort of thing? So, if it isn't the heads of states, if it's not the kings and the prime ministers, if it's not the heads of the intelligence services, then who is it?
Let's get rolling then. I'm sure you're ready.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I typically give people an idea of what they're going to be in for the next couple hours here. So yeah, for people that aren't familiar with your work, Rick, you are a historian and you were a professor of history at the University of Idaho for over 30 years, just retired a couple years ago. And some of the things that you've lectured on and written about and that we'll be talking about today include modern espionage and intelligence, cults, secret societies, true crime, and some serial killers, and a lot more, a bunch more fascinating topics. So, yeah, man, your work is fascinating, like I said, and thank you again for coming out from across the country to sit down and
Thanks for having
talk
me.
to us about it. So what about, we were talking a little bit last night about L. Ron Hubbard, who's the founder of Scientology. Have you looked into Scientology at all? Because we haven't discussed it on this show at all.
Scientology. Well, you have to be careful what you say about Scientology because they're highly litigious. Okay. And one could speculate that it doesn't matter whether they have a good case, it just matters how much money they can cost you. But anyway, so I just want to say right up front that I'm not attacking Scientology. That's not the whole point. Lots of people have said very bad things about Scientology. You have to judge for yourself whether that's true. Boilerplate legal defense, which is right. But it's arguably, one could argue, is that, well, here's my take on it. This is just my opinion. It doesn't mean anything beyond that. When I look at Scientology, what I see is a high-tech exorcism. So once you get high enough in this, as I understand it, which could be wrong, and where does this whole thing lead to? You go through the whole process. You've got the engrams. You go through the process of trying to become clear. Well, I've not gone through it. I've known a couple of people who have. But here's what it boils down to. You're infected with alien ghosts. Okay, because the Lord Zeno, a long time ago, some sort of galactic overlord, killed a lot of aliens by putting them aboard 747-looking spaceships and incinerating them, I think killing them with nuclear weapons over volcanoes in Hawaii, something like that. This involves volcanoes, Hawaii, nuclear bombs, millions of dead aliens. And so their ghosts freaked out and attached themselves to you, body thetans. So you're carrying around these angry alien spirits, not too strange of an idea if you look into the realms of occultism, and they must be exorcised from you. You must be freed from the influence of these parasitic beings that have been attached to you. Now, again, that's the way it was explained to me. So You'd have to go to the Church of Scientology to find out you're on. As I understand it, you don't get told that at the beginning. No, that doesn't come in till the very end, because if you start out with Lord Zeno and volcanoes and aliens, that wouldn't necessarily be the way to do it. No, you have troubles. You can't, it's Dianetics. It's the modern science of mental health. Okay? That's the way that it's built. And if you go in, you go through a kind of therapeutic process. And there's an E-meter, which is some sort of thing that gauges how supposedly, that some people argue that this is an important therapeutic tool. Other people argue that it's quackery. It's a thing with wires and lights that go off, and someone oh, you're sick, the light went off. Well, who knows? I'm not saying it's one way or the other. But it's aroused great, and people want the whole business. Look at how many things cater to the whole idea of self-improvement and of therapy. I mean, this is what you're told. There's something wrong with you. Just whatever you had. There's something wrong with you. You're overweight. You're unhealthy. You need to do this. And you just need to take this, do this, buy this, and you'll be much better. So there's an endless con of self-improvement. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't improve yourself in some way, but again, there's a lot of people that there are things that will actually help you, but there are just as many other things that are just a complete and total con. They do nothing other than they might have some kind of placebo effect, which I guess is an effect. I mean, if it helps, so much the better. And Scientology combines a number of elements. One, it's the Church of Scientology, which some might argue is there in order to get the benefits of being a church, as opposed to a medical group. It combines elements of religion. It provides elements of self-improvement, the whole kind of human potential idea that we can always be something more than what we actually are. And it's very appealing. And some people, it seems to help. Some people derive great benefit from it. Others have argued that it is a gigantic con that deceived them and ruined their lives. Now, what is it really? You'd have to go and find out on your own. But again, it's a matter of controversy. You have different realities, different descriptions as to what this is about. L. Ron Hubbard is an interesting character because he's certainly a guy who has from his standpoint, what's his kind of background? I find two things kind of interesting about it. One, science fiction. He's a science fiction writer. In the 30s and the 40s, he was a science fiction writer in L.A., and he hung out with people like Robert Heinlein, and he was also a friend of a rocket scientist and occultist by the name of John Whiteside Parsons, Jack Parsons, JPL. Parsons was a follower of British occultist Aleister Crowley.
There he is.
All right. You know that Aleister Crowley is going to have to show up, because Aleister Crowley shows up in everything. So Hubbard seems to have absorbed all of this stuff. I mean, he wrote science fiction novels. So he was imaginative in that way, a kind of futurist. He understood the appeal of those stories. He knew how to craft a good story. So there are some who argue, as opposed to who theorize, that what Hubbard did, L. Ron in this case, was to take essentially the plot for a sci-fi story and then turn it into this kind of pseudo-religion and market it to people. And he got people to pay him for it. That's an allegation. And that became Dianetics and the Church of Scientology. So you turn fiction into a kind of reality and you market it as an interesting possibility. So here again, you got a case of L. Ron Hubbard, who I think is widely, fairly or not, viewed as as a kind of villainous character. The creator of a pseudo-religion, the manipulator of people, a person who not only manipulates people, but ruin their lives, a con man of the greatest, of the first order. And it's possible he was all of that. But it's also possible when he says that he was working for naval intelligence or American intelligence to thwart enemy spies around Jack Parsons, that there may be some element of truth in that. So it comes back to this thing I mentioned before about disinformation, which is key to much of this. And it's maybe the most important thing that tends to permeate a lot of this sort of intelligence world. Because everything is about, what are you trying to do as a spy agency? Well, you're trying to safeguard your secrets and you're trying to steal other people's. And one of the things that requires is that you got to be sneaky when you do that. It requires active, deliberate dishonesty, not accidental dishonesty. So lying, come back to that whole thing again, the L word, lying, skillfully lying, deliberately and manipulatively lying is a key element in this. And it can become a kind of world that people live in. And the more you do that, the more difficult it can be even for you after a period of time to know what's true and what isn't. There are people who live lies, who live under different identities, that even their own family, their loved ones, their wives, their children never really know who they are. In Fred Chrisman's case, that might have been the truth, is that none of these people knew who they were. And so disinformation is not misinformation. Misinformation is a mistake. It's usually erroneous. It's like you're lost and you pull over and ask someone if they know the directions to the airport or whatever it is, and they give you what they think are the directions, and then you get even more lost. So they didn't do that deliberately. Well, maybe they did, but they were just wrong. Misinformation is a mistake. Disinformation is deliberate. It's never a mistake. And the basic purpose in disinformation could be said to lead the hounds away from the fox. Misdirect. How do you do that? Well, good disinformation has to be at least partly, maybe mostly, true. There has to be something which is confirmable in it, because usually we'll try to check on it. And here's the way we often go, human beings being often somewhat lazy. If we can check out part of something, we find out that this checks out, and that checks out, and that checks out. At a certain point, you assume it all checks out. These points seem to be true. And there's a couple of things here I can't check out, but since I think of it this way, you've got 10 points of information here, and you can confirm 9 of them, and the 10th one you can't. But the odds are that must be correct. Well, no, you just swallowed the poison pill. Because that is the disinformation. That's what's going to lead you off in the wrong direction. But disinformation is often a lie concealed within a large matrix of truth. And it's to get you to swallow it, to take the poison pill, and be led off in that direction. But it can have another purpose as well. It's never quite as simple as that. You can also put the poison pill, you can take a lie and embed it in a matrix of truth. Not with the purpose of getting them to take the bait and be led astray, but of discrediting the truth it's connected to. So you'll tell a true story, but you'll embed something in it which is a partially hidden lie, but one with a little effort you will discover. It will eventually. So at first it seems to pass muster. And again, you can figure out that of 10 different points of information, that 9 of them you confirm and the other one you can't. But then the reaction might be is that you find out that 10th one is a lie. And now it's poisoned everything else. And the purpose of that is to take the truth and turn it into an apparent lie. To reveal the story, but in such a way that it will be contaminated with lies that will then make that whole story appear to be untrue. So if anybody comes up and starts saying that type of thing again, we can go, well, this was all shown to be completely false. And that may sound to be incredibly devious, but it happens a lot.
Okay, so you mentioned lying and kind of living in this gray or morally flexible sort of area. I know you've also spoken about like when it comes to either, you know, planned assassinations or just killing in general. I think the way we understand CIA, and I don't know if it applies to other agencies as well, is that a case officer that's running a source is not going to typically have to kill somebody, right? That's why they have, you know, the CIA has a paramilitary arm, and it's largely become a paramilitary organization after 9/11. But they have people, I don't know what they're calling it, special activities or ground branch now, to go and do those things. But in other agencies, are case officers expected to do that killing as well, or do they also have specialized units for it?
It would depend on the circumstance, probably. I mean, if you have to protect your operation or protect yourself. Ordinarily, though, you wouldn't compromise yourself that way. I mean, killing is something that you contract out. There are people who do that. Right? There are hitmen, and you hire them or you employ them as the same way you would other specialists. Those are people who do that type of thing for a living. But if the circumstances, you know, I think what's his name? David Cornwell, John le Carré, the British spy writer, the best spy writer in my worthless estimation, because I think he's fairly honest about it. And I think he was describing his recruitment into British intelligence. This is probably World War II or just before. And one of the first things that he was told by his recruiter was that, well, you're going to have to be willing to do two things. You're going to have to be willing to lie, and you're going to have to be willing to kill. And if you don't think you can do those things, then this is not for you. Now, the interesting thing is that he'd already in some way that fellow wouldn't have told him that if he didn't think that he would. And you're sized up before that type of thing is going to happen. You just don't willy-nilly recruit people. You generally have been studied for a while. There's one person who will do the spotting, and then they'll actually pass you over to someone else, and then at some point you'll actually get the offer. But the pitch isn't made initially, whether or not you tend to fit that. But if the circumstances arose, yes, what else are you going to do? You're going to freeze? You want to spend the rest of your life in an Afghan prison? Or are you going to kill someone? And if you do that, you have to do it, as I am told, without hesitation, which a lot of people couldn't do. So if you have, and here's an interesting way that it was put to me once, and I can kind of identify this with. I don't know whether this makes me a sociopath or not. So you hear about someone opposing an action which is illegal or immoral in some ways. But as one person told me, he says, you know, when I hear about that possibility, it never really comes down to a question as to whether this is right or wrong. I don't quite understand what that is. It comes down to, what's the cost benefit in this? What are the chances of being caught? In other words, this is a stupid idea that I won't participate in, not because I think it is morally wrong, but because I don't think I can get away with it, and there doesn't seem to be sufficient gain to make that kind of risk. And I'd have to say that even personally, that I don't think of myself as being immoral, that's often the way that I'll kind of size things up. That just seems to be, if I'm sort of appreciating what other people are doing, that was a stupid thing to do because you took a risk that you had very little chance of getting away with and very little to gain. We're not going to discuss whether this was greater, right or wrong in a greater scheme, but it was a bad choice because you couldn't get away with it. So if you could get away with it, was it good? Well, it's just a choice that one would have. But I think that's, I suggest to anybody out there who's listening to this, the next time you're going to look at the way, what are you weighing here? Are you making a kind of moral choice that this is just wrong, or I can't get away with it, therefore it's a bad idea? And then try to figure out what you would do in those kinds of circumstances.
So you mentioned contracting things out. Have you looked into private intelligence at all?
Well, they're more organized than I think they were in the past, but that's always been around. It's a kind of, not making an exact comparison, but there's always been the distinction between the police, between law enforcement and criminal investigation, and then there's the PI. There are private investigators, not real police, but people who sometimes have badges that go around and flash, but who perform the same kind of function, but without any kind of official sanction. And therefore, arguably, in many cases, have to be a lot sneakier about what it is that they do. So one of the things that often private investigators will do is to obscure as much as they possibly can the distinction between themselves and law enforcement. Maybe to the point of occasionally making people believe that they are law enforcement to get their cooperation. But then they're also not bound by certain things. They are at once more restricted in what they can do, but also somewhat freer what they can do. Because they're not cops. They don't have to read you your Miranda rights. So there's always this kind of market for the privatization of things that might otherwise be governmental functions in some way. But then why would people like that exist? Well, again, to go back to the statute establishing the CIA and the things they don't have police power, they don't have judicial power, they can't arrest you, they can't actually legally interrogate you, they can't adjudicate you, they have no judicial or police powers, but other people do. So one of the ways that you get around that restriction is you get other people to do it for you. Well, they can't arrest you, but the county sheriff can. And if the county sheriff is on your payroll or is compromised in some way, then you can get him to arrest someone. That's all you have to do. He and his deputies can arrest you and maybe even allegedly beat a confession out of you, if that's what you need. CIA hasn't done that. That was done by local law enforcement issues. And there may have been money exchanged, there may not have been money exchanged. Who knows what happened under these circumstances? Okay? Somebody disappeared. Thomas Reha vanished. Is that because he wanted to vanish or someone else wanted him to disappear? So you privatize that type of thing. There's no reason for the agency to necessarily do a lot of dirty work on its own. And there have always been sort of contract employees, and these people who weren't they're not regular governmental employees. There's a contract to put out and you perform a particular service. And that service could be providing information, and that service can be killing people. That service can be piloting a plane full of cocaine.
You never know.
You never know. Whatever it is that you're paid to do.
So, but at what point, take like a Booz Allen Hamilton or somebody, similar. At what point does an organization like that start to have their own agenda?
From the very beginning. That's why they're in business. There's an agenda to make money. There's also the question about why would you use private contractors for like security work, for instance? Well, one of the things, they're not bound by the Freedom of Information Act. They're a private company. So if it's Air Force security, or if it's even CIA, intelligence records are generally pretty much safeguarded from freedom of information. Okay, you're not going to get, but it's still a public record. And at some point, people might be able to get some nosy congressman might be able to get a hold of that. Anything which is public record, anything which is generated by and for a governmental agency can potentially be seen by someone else. But private businesses, they don't have to provide anyone with information. You can get a subpoena and you can get judges to do that type of thing, but records can disappear. They're not immediately accessible. No one has a right to see those things. So that's where I think the main impetus for using private contractors comes involved. And you can make entire companies who do this type of thing.
I don't know about you guys, but I have an exceptionally hard time finding jeans that I like. They're either too skinny, too baggy, or the leg opening's too big. It looks like I'm wearing my mom's bootcut jeans. So these are the perfect jean. These are their slim fit, so it's the best of both worlds for me. Not too skinny, not too baggy either. They're super comfortable. They're not going to crush your nuts or give you like a saggy diaper butt in jeans. And they're surprisingly stretchy and soft. You could do all kinds of stuff in them, bend down, do what you got to do. And the crazy part is that they're only $79.99, so they're way more affordable than your typical pair of jeans. So for a limited time, our listeners are getting 15% off plus free shipping if you go to theperfectjean.nyc and use code Dalton15 at checkout. That's 15% off for new customers at theperfectjean.nyc with promo code Dalton15. And after you purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please support the show and let them know that we sent you. Life takes a toll on your body, and one of the first places you feel it is your back. Maybe you tried swapping out your mattress thinking that's the solution. And sure, a good mattress helps, but something I didn't realize is that your bed frame may actually be the problem. So there's an Australian startup called Sleeping Duck. They're founded by aerospace engineers, and they ran some stress tests on beds, and they found something surprising. They discovered that even with good mattresses, the bed frames, which are usually made out of flimsy, lightweight materials, often sag, completely compromising your support. So what they did is they engineered a bed called the Indestruct bed. And they built its core with over 110 pounds of structural grade steel, and they put steel beams under the backs of the sleeper. It's so much more supportive on the back that it became a bestseller in Australia, and now it's finally here in the States. So I really encourage you guys to check it out. Every part is precision engineered, and it comes with sleek designs to fit your space as well. So try it out for yourself. It comes with a 100-day trial. Head over to sleepingduck.com and give it a look. Back to the show. Can you? I've heard you, or actually in one of your courses, you talk about the motivations to spy, or MICE, I think is the acronym, which is the motivations of someone that is committing treason, not the motivations of the case officer that is committing espionage. So the actual person spying themselves. But can you talk to us about some of those motivations and how they manifest themselves?
Well, MICE is money, ideology, coercion, ego. The last one is the trickiest and probably the most important. Money's pretty simple. You bribe them. Okay, we need secrets. We want the rocket fuel formula. Here's some money. You know what you're dealing with. It's a mercenary exchange. Ideology, that was very powerful. That was one of the things that Soviet intelligence used for decades very effectively. Communism was a religion to many people. It was firmly held, and you appealed to them as a communist in pursuit of the goals of the movement. You have a duty to help the socialist motherland and your true country. As a communist, the Soviet Union was your true country, and that was what you owed loyalty to. So through and that was quite effective. Coercion, well, if money and ideology doesn't work, you just get some dirt on them and you force them to do it. Not too difficult. Then you come to ego. You appeal to the person's ego. You look for someone who feels unappreciated, overworked, resentful. They didn't get a promotion. They think their bosses are idiots. They think they're the smartest person in the room who is underestimated by everybody else. And you exploit that. And you say, your bosses don't appreciate it, but we appreciate you. we appreciate you so much that we want you to work for us. And often it's a combination of those things. One of the arch traitors of the 20th century, Soviet spy Kim Philby, who rose quite high in British intelligence and could have gone very far in that regard. I mean, he was born into the British elite. He could have had a career. He didn't do this for money. Probably did it for ideology to some point because he was an avowed communist. But at one point, Philby said, "You never look twice at the offer of enlistment in an elite force." And what he was referring to was his offer of service from what would become the KGB. And he was flattered by that. I think that's the main impetus in it. And that can become part of that, that the other side, the adversary, and this is very often the type of thing, is that you begin to appreciate your adversary. These are the people you're fighting, and it's a tough fight, and they're very good at what they do. And you admire that. You admire their dedication. And the mere fact that they would want you is a great ego boost. That's reflecting that these people that you know are tough as nails and utterly ruthless and dangerous, nevertheless think that you could be part of them. That can be the appeal. It's a psychological manipulation, which always involves the willing participation of the person who's being manipulated.
Yeah, I had a KGB officer in here. Are you familiar with Jack Barsky?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had him in here.
Yeah, I saw that.
And so I was talking to him a bit about this and about, the different agencies. And I know you get asked a lot about, over time, what's the what has been the most effective intelligence agency out of like today's agencies, whether that be, the CIA, the Mossad, the Russians, I don't know if it's the GRU or whatever their equivalent is, the MI6, the French, like what is the most, let's say, capable in your opinion?
Well, they're all capable. Which is the most? These are like, what's my favorite color? The British, the reason why I will usually, in the historical sense, say the Russian is simply because of institutional longevity. Because there is a direct carryover between Tsarist Russian intelligence to Soviet intelligence to modern Russian intelligence. It's basically the same agency. All of those sort of inherited many of the personnel and the same kind of techniques. Whereas again, Mossad technically begins in 1948 with the creation of Israel, but there had been a kind of, you could argue there was an effective Zionist intelligence movement before that. I mean, the people had been collecting information. It just didn't, it's not like, let's start an intelligence agency and you go out and recruit some people. It also had the advantage of getting people who had been parts of other intelligence agencies. I mean, what the Mossad was eventually assembled from, it had no track record. There were people there who had worked for everything from the OSS to the British to the French to the Soviets. And that's, I think, one of its strengths. It was able to, through that diverse personnel, to bring in elements from all of those different services. So much like the Israeli military, Israeli intelligence, foreign intelligence, the Mossad has been highly effective. And it's not because of how large they are. It has to do with dedication of purpose. It has to do with the variety of experience that you could create within the organization. And they have been, I don't think this, in terms of combating their primary enemy, which, let's face it, are Arab governments and also things like the PLO and the rest, that they have held the advantage in that for the most part. I could be wrong, but I can't think of any opposition, any Arab intelligence agencies, Egyptians or otherwise, who have ever been able to effectively combat. And one of the things to look at this is who's infiltrating who. And that goes back to something again. British intelligence tends to get very high marks generally, and MI6 is effective, but part of that's also the James Bond myth, which, if you ask me, and you are, that the whole James Bond myth, which notice comes out of the series of films that begins in the 60s, notice the fact that the whole James Bond popularization, not so much the Fleming novels themselves, but the popular image of British intelligence through James Bond is an antidote to the failures of British intelligence, which culminated in Philby's defection. They were a leaky ship. It was one mole after another. Burgess, McLean, Philby, George Blake, Anthony Blunt. They were infested. Now, certainly, there were probably British moles inside the Soviet intelligence structure, although you don't hear about them. The British don't boast about them. Russians don't boast, but there were some. But overall, who managed to get inside each other's house more effectively? The Russians did. And that large amount had to do with ideology. It may have had the appeal of ego, but beginning in the 1930s, they were able to systematically infiltrate British intelligence to the point of seriously compromising its credibility. If you were the CIA and you were looking at MI6 in the early 60s, you couldn't trust these people. They were a leaky ship. You never knew who the next mole was going to come from next. Clearly, something had systematically gone wrong. So there was a failure there. So British intelligence was successful in many of the things that it did, but it was compromisable, and it was seriously compromised. And that's one of the reasons why I would not. It doesn't mean that most people weren't doing their job, but the agency as a whole had problems, and there were systemic failures in it. And that's the great fear. In the CIA, that's what James Jesus Angleton spent his entire counterintelligence career worrying about. And he was obsessed with the idea that there was a Soviet mole inside the agency. Some people thought he was being paranoid. He thought he was being prudent. Was he paranoid? Was he prudent? Well, you know the moles that get caught. You don't know the ones that don't get uncovered. And that becomes part of a very ticklish situation in which, if you are a mole which is infiltrated another organization, the whole idea is you want to stay in place, which means that you have to be very careful how you proceed. If suddenly everything goes wrong, then sooner or later that's going to point back to you. So you're going to have to let operations proceed against your actual employer simply to maintain your cover. That would be necessary, which means that your agency itself has to be willing to sacrifice some of its own people in order to maintain in place, in order to maintain the credibility, the cover of a more important agent. So those, again, could be argued to be sociopathic decisions. These people all work for us, and they're all perfectly loyal, and this person has done a particular job, but we're going to throw them under the bus, literally, because we need to sacrifice them to protect a more important agent. That's just a mathematical calculation that you would make.
Okay, so, wow, there's a lot of points that I want to come back to, but you mentioned that idea of sacrificing one of your own. So that reminds me of this story that I heard from a Mossad officer. To try to keep it concise and not butcher the story. Essentially, the idea was that they had compromised somebody that was involved with either, I don't recall, it was either Hamas or some sort of Palestinian organization. They had recruited this person, and he started working for the Mossad. And what happened is they started to use him, and the Palestinians basically asked him to go find out like something kind of benign or out in the open about the Israeli like structure of the way things were. And I forget what the context was, but the Mossad said, okay, well, we assume that this information, like if you can see it, then he can see it, and it's out there enough, like it's not gonna hurt us. Give him the information to build the trust. So so he does. He gives the Palestinians the information, and then they ask him to go find a spot in the border wall so that the Palestinians can sneak into Israel. And so he tells the Mossad this, and they said, okay, well, let's find a spot together. And, this is where he'll tell him to go. And then we'll have a little surprise waiting for him on the other side. So they do that. He tells them the spot, and they said, okay, well, we want you to come with us, just kind of as an insurance policy. And he tells the Mossad this. And again, this is the Mossad officer recounting this afterwards in an interview. And he says, basically their calculus was that if we tell him no, or if he says I can't go, that would kind of blow his cover, or at least raise a red flag and possibly burn him as an agent or as a resource. So they told him, okay, well, go with them. When you get over the border and the gunshots start, hit the deck, and we have ways to make sure that you're not hit. And essentially that was total bullshit. And basically their calculus was, and the way he explained it was sacrificing a pawn off the chessboard. Mm-hmm. And so how often does an intelligence agency like burn their own agents like that?
Well, if you're a career service officer, you would get more protection than you would if you're an asset. I mean, it's the assets who are disposable. Those are people who are recruited for a particular purpose. You're using them. And there's a less need. Their survival is not as important as someone who is a GS-15, someone who is part of the organization. And there's that distinction. If you're an asset, I think people tend to confuse what's the difference between an intelligence officer. An intelligence officer is someone who has a rank and a position and a salary. They're a government employee. They are an assigned employee of the particular agency of a particular government. They're a real person in the view of that agency. Assets are the people who are recruited for a particular task. Usually it's for information. It can be disinformation. It's for any kind of purpose, and they're just there as needed. They're like someone you hire to come in and install tile in your house or elsewhere. They do a job and then they're gone. You have no long commitment to them. You're perfectly friendly to them as long as you're there, out of common politeness. But you're going to pay them off, and they'll disappear, or you'll kill them off, and it will disappear. If there's any problem about them talking about what they did otherwise. The thing you never want to be in any situation, you should always look around for, is to be a loose end. And there's a particular, I go back to Jean Le Carré and Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which is probably my favorite book and spy film. And particularly if you see the Richard Burton film, and there's a character, I won't go through the whole complicated plot in this, but it's all about keeping secrets. And there's one female character who gets involved in this. In many ways, she's just a perfect innocent, but she's built into it. But in the end of this, she has become a loose end. She knows way too much. There's no way she's going to survive. She will have to be killed. And the main character sacrifices himself at that as well. It's a spoiler in the film in this case, but that's it. But that was known from the beginning that would have to be the case. That this person will be used, and then they will be discarded, and they will be eliminated. So I don't know. It's just more examples of lying and the human capacity for deceit. But you see, it's all for a greater cause.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Isn't that the thing? That's in fact what in the Spy Who Came In From the Cold thing, the head of British intelligence is telling him to begin with. It's all part of a greater cause. You may do unpleasant things, but we're on the side of freedom. See?
You also mentioned Angleton, who was the chief of
from Idaho.
Oh, was he?
Yes.
He was the chief of counterintelligence at CIA, right? Was there something? Have you looked into him at all? Like, has he come up in your work?
Angleton?
Yeah, I don't recall his kind of like why he's a curious character.
Well, Angleton was seen by a lot of people in the agency as being paranoid. And that was his job. He's the mole hunter. He's supposed to protect the castle from within. So remember, you're trying to get other people's secrets. They're trying to get yours. You're trying to infiltrate other agencies. They're trying to infiltrate you. And they do. And one of the things that he knew is the Soviets were damn good at that. And we do have human weaknesses around us. And there were people who believed, particularly by the 60s, that Angleton's concern had become paranoia and that was harming the agency and that he was casting suspicions on people who didn't deserve that. And that's demoralizing. I mean, do you want to work in a company in which you're constantly mistrusted? But he saw that as his job. I mean, if he's not doing that, somebody's got to be paranoid. And, we come back again to this question, what's true? What's the reality here? And from Engel's standpoint, the reality of Soviet infiltration was an omnipresent threat. You've seen what happens with the Brits, that this can be done. And I think it's probably fair to say that Angleton always suspected that there was a mole that he didn't find. You don't know that there could be one, and that made him suspicious of people, and it probably did obstruct people's careers, and it may even have ruined some of them. But again, from his standpoint, it comes down to this question of suspicion. What do you go by? So in law, you eventually have to prove someone's guilt. But institutionally, you don't. All you have to do is suspect. So it's one of the things you can find a parallel to, in some ways, I think, if you look at the Stalin-era purges. Often that's pointed to as just being an example of complete irrationality, that the Soviets were just, executing people right and left on, for no particular reason. But usually what was at the basis of that, not that they weren't sometimes doing another reason, was suspicion. And that suspicion may have based nothing more on propinquity, that is, that you simply knew someone who was a traitor, but that created the possibility that there might be some question about your own loyalty. And you can either go, what's your attitude going to be in this case? Well, I can't prove it. This guy, some of his friends were Trotskyites. Okay, I don't know whether he was or not. So do we just kind of let this slide? Do you take a chance? Or do you eliminate any possibility of there being a chance by eliminating the person? And that might be why take the chance? If there's any possibility, any question about that loyalty. And that's why you would go through entire bureaus or branches, even of your own intelligence service, and just liquidate people. Because there could be no toleration for any kind of doubt. Now, that's cruel, arguably inhumane, in many cases probably excessive, paranoid even. But it can be effective. It will, there'll be downsides to it. You could be getting rid of a lot of potentially useful people. But if your goal is to eliminate as much as humanly possible the chance of treason, what else can you do? And that, I think, was part of Angleton couldn't quite go after as many people as he wanted to in that case. He was restrained by it. But always believed that there was more going on that he could effectively combat. Or was he just paranoid?
So, and you also mentioned when we were talking about coercion as part of mice, you mentioned just having dirt on people and kind of using that as leverage. And I want to get into some of the Epstein stuff, but I guess as a precursor to that, there's a lot of CIA officers say that blackmail is just not as effective as you would think it to be. And maybe that's a diversion, maybe it's true, I don't know. But like in your opinion, how effective is blackmail really?
Well, it depends upon what you've got. I mean, if you really got something that's going to completely destroy this person if you release it publicly, or they can, that's one of the things. I don't think I've ever been blackmailed, but one of the things is call their bluff. I mean, is it really be that bad? Okay, in that regard, and then see what they're going to do about it. Well, the thing is, when you use coercion against somebody, they're going to resent that. Okay, then you've got, it's like a hostile witness on the stand. You're going to have to pry things out of them. They're not cooperating willingly. You want people to cooperate willingly. So you can never entirely trust what they're going to say. And, when they get the chance, if the chance does offer itself to them, well, they're going to screw you back. Why wouldn't they? You're blackmailing them. So you better have something on them which is good. Maybe the more effective thing is not to have something on them, but to have something on someone else that they're close to. People will often be more protective and other than they would of themselves. Especially, I don't remember who it was, but I think it was in an Elton constitution. Get a hold of the kids and you can get the adults to do anything. Threaten their children. So, man, how would the cartel handle this? Well, brutal, but if we're not going to harm you. We're not going to do anything to you. But if you do what we want, we'll kill your wife, we'll kill your children, we'll kill everyone close to you. And you'll know that you're responsible for it. So you can cooperate. So, but you're always dealing with an unwilling subject. In that kind of a situation, you're a bit like a lion tamer. You got the whip, you got the pistol, you got the chair. And as long as you use those effectively, you can make the lion do what you want. But mess up just once, turn your back, give them one moment, and they'll turn on you. So see, ego and money and ideology are so much easier to do than coercion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess it does change the entire dynamic of the relationship, and it's probably not a go-to. It's probably on the back end of
it's kind of the last resort.
Okay, so there's, I guess, like situationally, right? I don't know if this is part of training at CIA, but obviously they give you scenarios and they ask you how you'd react in those scenarios. And so like let's use a scenario of basically when you're running an asset, you are, as a Mossad agent or officer put it, you're fulfilling their desires, right? So if they want if they want money, great. But if they want something darker, which is probably often the case, if they want drugs or if they want pornography or if they want child pornography, or let's say they even, they ask you for a prostitute. You give them a prostitute? Probably, yeah. What if they ask you for a child prostitute? What I'm getting at is where are, along that path of fulfilling people's desires, like where do agencies draw the line? And are there things that certain agencies aren't willing to do?
Well, how important is it? Does this person have invaluable information that no one else can get you? Is that the only source you have? Is it critical to what you want? Then you do the math. Okay. Again, it comes down to a calculation. It's just a formula. If they're the only ones who have that information and you desperately need it, if it's a matter of life and death on your end, then the math would tell you you'll give them whatever they want. You didn't give them those desires. You're just facilitating them, and you need their cooperation. Not to say that you can't suddenly get on your moral high horse and say that no. I mean, that's the point that you either as an agent handler or someone else would draw the line. But where is that? If your job is to get the information, then you'll do whatever is necessary to get the information. And, I mean, that person is the pervert. Not, I mean, you can make up all kinds of excuses that you want to. Point is, if you want the information bad enough, you'll do what's necessary to get it. Or you won't, and you'll fail. Choice is yours. You don't have to reckon with God now. That's later.
Do you think that the higher ups at these agencies, like in the executive suite, do you think that they delegate or they try to delegate as much as they can to the individual handler or case officer and let them make those decisions so they can keep their hands clean to a degree? Or do you think everyone's complicit?
Well, I think one of the misconceptions, again, I could be wrong, but it shouldn't work, that people have is that everybody in these agencies knows everybody else's business. Can't work that way. It's an agent handler is the person who should know who his agents are. Maybe his superior might be, but is everybody in the agency going to know who this guy is handling? No. That breaks the first rule of, if you don't need to know it, it's not there. If you're, the way that I would see it, if you're the director of Central Intelligence or the head of Mossad or whatever it is, probably you're a political appointee for the most part. I mean, you may have a background in intelligence, you may not. Alan Dulles, ran this OSS, but he's still a kind of parvenu in these things. I mean, he didn't start out in that regard. So you're managing an entire agency. You're not managing agents in the field. That's why all these people work for you. That's why there are thousands of people there to do all of this stuff. And, a lot of these people are just analysts in some form or another. You don't pay anybody. Everybody sort of does their job, and hopefully the whole kind of organization works. And it's easier not to know in some way. Orders often given can be, it's a bit like the mafia. You tell Vito, I need you to go to Jersey and take care of this thing for me. Well, it's understood what is meant in that case, but if the FBI is listening, you just didn't say go kill someone. There's a thing that needs to be taken care of. So I would assume, and I would think from sheer efficiency, that the higher up it goes, the more managerial it becomes, and the less that you concern yourself with those type of things. If you're the director, you assume that all of your minions below you are all selflessly and efficiently performing their tasks, whatever those may do. That could be cleaning the restrooms. You don't concern yourself with that. That could be handling agents in Pakistan or elsewhere. That's what that person does. You don't need to know those things. And it works better when you go before Congress and you can swear that I know absolutely nothing about this. And you probably don't. Nobody told you because you don't want to be told about it.
Well, there you go. Okay, so let's segue into the Epstein stuff, because I guess let's start with the foundation layer here. In your opinion, was Epstein an intelligence construct?
I don't know if he was a construct. Let's put it this way. From my perspective, if someone wasn't making use of the information that he had available, then somebody wasn't doing their job. That's very interesting stuff which is going on there. I don't know. Let's start at the beginning. Did he hang himself in his jail cell? Well, what do you think? Could have been so despondent that he did that. But overall, death was very, very convenient. But you don't know. That's a question that's the question that's never supposed to be answered and is unanswerable in this case. Why weren't the cameras going? Why weren't people where they were supposed to be? It's, again, would this reasonably make you suspicious that this was more than a simple suicide? Yes. You have to be, excuse the term, an idiot not to at least consider the possibility in that regard. But you can't prove it, but you're not supposed to. So if you look at Epstein, okay, this is what I see in Epstein for what it's worth. You got basically a smart kid, okay? Doesn't come from any particular background, but what he's good at is that he's good at numbers. And he makes friends with important people. And his career really seems to get going when he figures out new ways to dodge taxes. That's how he meets rich people, because he can come up with different means, different strategies to avoid a tax burden. Tax dodging, legally, sort of. And wealthy people are grateful for that type of thing. That's what earns him important friends. And then along the way, well, if you're helping rich people avoid taxes, then you know certain things. Information that might be valuable to someone else. People take you into their confidence. You then monetize the confidence that you get. That's what I think he did, is that he monetized the confidence that people, first of all, they trusted him with their money, which may or may not have been a good idea. And then they began to trust him with other confidence. And then he begins to supply them with things. Okay? You want to go to my private island and have sex with young girls? Which just, well, apparently some people do. And then, and he's recording this. Now, his female accomplice, how do you pronounce her first name?
Ghislaine.
Ghislaine.
It's either Ghislaine or
Ghislaine. Okay, it's one of the, let's call her Ghislaine.
Ghislaine,
Okay,
for the
there
sake
we
of this
go.
conversation.
Sake of this conversation.
I don't think anybody will.
Well, if we're wrong, I apologize, Ghislaine.
She won't see it for another 19 years.
Yeah,
So.
well, might cut a deal. But they're recording this, they're getting compromised. Why are you doing it? I think her argument was we're doing it to protect ourselves. From what? So either they were collecting the information to run blackmail on their own, or but you have a saleable asset there. And this is certainly one of the things that Jeffrey Epstein would have, he's into monetizing things. His skill with money is a saleable asset. The, alleged video of Prince Andrew doing things to underage girls. So, that gives you leverage. And who would be interested in that kind of information? Other people who wanted to manipulate these people. So my suspicion would be that either he was an entrepreneur who was monetizing the trust that other people placed in him by gratifying their desires, and then offering that for sale to whoever was interested in it. Or the other possibility is that he was in effect the kind of servant of some higher source that was using him. So is he working on his own, or is he simply an asset which is being controlled? Either one of those seem to be perfectly plausible. Was he just doing it for his own entertainment? That seems less like. So many things here. Just rather than trying to figure out what's true and what's false, just consider that there are a range of possibilities. That's what exists. And then try to calculate which of those range of possibilities seems more likely. I think it's the best that you can come up with. And what seems likely, even arguably obvious to me, is that this information, this whole database on the sins of the high and mighty, was being collected for some mercenary purpose, or was going to be applied in some form. Now, whether that was one or more intelligence agencies, or, well, here's one of the things people don't consider. Are there things that we would talk about governments and intelligence agencies, but are there entities that exist beyond that?
Such
Is
as?
there something else? It comes down to the question of where is the pinnacle of control? Okay, not straying too far off into Illuminati territory here, but that's why people tend to suspect this type of thing. That it's some years back, and this all sort of started when I was trying to research the very murky career of this guy named Sidney Riley, who's kind of a British agent and kind of not. And there are other people who are interested in similar figures, and we were mostly looking at things that involve British intelligence in the early 20th century. And the question would come up every now and then is we're always trying to calculate this, but who in the British hierarchy is manipulating these things? So does this go up to the top of MI6? Is that what we're talking about? Is it Mansfield Cumming? Is the director of the service, is he the hand behind this? Or is there maybe something in the Royal Palace? Is that part of it? Is there some other agency? Or how high does this go? Who's actually pulling the strings? Because sometimes in the way that you would look at this, it was difficult to figure out what it was the British government was actually getting out of this situation. It began to look as if the British hierarchy itself was being manipulated in some way, that rather than British intelligence manipulating everything, that it itself was being manipulated. So we came up with a term for that. We call it Factor X. Yeah, I don't know whether there was anything, but it was a not unreasonable suspicion that the intelligence service itself, rather than being in control of the situation, was itself being controlled and manipulated by some kind of superior or unseen authority. And that's about as really as I would go with it. So it's, who else might be interested in that kind of information? Because you're talking about getting compromising information on very important, very powerful people. Who are more important and powerful than they are? Who would be willing to blackmail them and compromise them and potentially destroy them? Who is it who doesn't think that they can be touched by the same sort of thing? So, if it isn't the heads of states, if it's not the kings and the prime ministers, if it's not the heads of the intelligence services, then who is it? I don't know. Really. See, that's the most dissatisfying answer in the world, isn't it? I don't know. But I don't. And it's one of those that you have to be willing to say. And I think it's one of the things I really expect you to come up with an answer for something and to explain it. And no, I can't explain it. I would merely express that there is a suspicion that something of that order could exist, and you should keep your eyes open for it. You should not discount it as a possibility. But don't try to force it to some kind of conclusion. I think that's where you often run afoul of things where you get some idea, you get some sort of pet story in your head. You've now created some sort of narrative. It's going to be the Illuminati, or it's the Bilderbergers, or something of this kind. And you're going to seize on that. And then suddenly the story will then start controlling it. It is a possibility that the people that we think are in control are not in control. Frankly, when I look at most heads of states and other political leadership, I'm surprised those people are where they are. I'm not impressed by them on the whole. I don't know why those people are in control. Anyway, there we go.
Okay. I think people, again, we're speculating, right?
Yes.
We're not going to arrive at an answer, but we're talking about the available information and trying to piece it together in a way that moves towards a conclusion. And
just always keep in mind when you're speculating. Don't let your speculation become fact. And some people argue, well, you should never speculate. Well, if you never speculate beyond what you have, you never get anywhere. Nothing would ever be invented. Okay, if somebody had said, this might work, let's give it a try. Well, 50% chance you get killed. Okay, you die. The other, you invent something important. You move ahead in that way. So speculation is useful, but it's just that. It is a possibility which exists. But we all exist within a range of possibilities. Everything's a possibility. It's a crapshoot whether you're going to live to see the next day. You don't like to think about it that way, but it is, right? So everything is a range of possibility. The size up the story, does the story just seem to be, develop a good BS detector. It's usually not that hard. If the story sounds unbelievable and stupid, then it probably is. Could be true, though, so don't completely ash can it right away, but don't put that at the front burner. That's just one of the, until you get more information, don't worry about that too much. Pay going on. So in the case of Epstein, this much we can say, something was going on. No one would go to the kind of, he was certainly intelligent enough to monetize the information he had, which must have been why he was gathering it to begin with. Who was the consumer of that information? Well, any number of people. Any intelligence agency in the world would be interested in that type of thing. It doesn't have to be just one. And if he's an entrepreneur, he's selling to everybody. And then again, there's the possibility that there is some, but this is the other thing I come back to when people talk about something like the Illuminati. Look, if there's somebody running the world, then they're running the world. So where do I sign up? I mean, if they're already so completely in control, then surrender, Dorothy, I suppose. I mean, what are you fighting against? You're fighting against something that you can't even see or believe. I think that's why so much attention gets focused on things like the Bohemian Club and Bohemian Grove, because people can see what appear to be rich weirdos in the woods doing things, and they're simultaneously running the world.
We'll get to the Bohemian Club. What's up, guys? Are you still carrying around the crusty old wallet that you've had since high school? It's time for an upgrade. This is my Ridge wallet. It's sleek, minimalist, and it can still hold up to 12 cards, and it has a cash trap in the back as well. These are made from premium, high-quality materials like carbon fiber, stainless steel, and titanium, so they're built to last. And they also come with a lifetime warranty, meaning this is the last wallet you ever need to buy. And it's not just about looks. Sitting on a bulky wallet all day is terrible for your back. So a slimmer Ridge wallet helps you keep your posture balanced and your back pain free. And two things I think are really cool about this is it comes with RFID protection to protect you from digital pickpockets and scammers. And you can also get an AirTag attachment where the cash strap is, just in case you lose your wallet. So for a limited time, our listeners are getting 10% off Ridge wallet if you use code DFP at checkout. All you need to do is head to ridge.com/DFP and use code DFP and you're all set. So after you purchase a wallet, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please do me a favor and support the show and tell them that we sent you. Choosing work boots used to mean sacrificing comfort or durability. If they felt good, they didn't last, and if they lasted, they wrecked your feet. Brunt Workwear has finally ended that trade-off. They design boots that withstand the toughest job sites while feeling as comfortable as your favorite sneakers. So Brunt's founder, Eric Gerard, grew up blue collar, and he started Brunt after his friends in the trade encouraged him to start a workwear brand that was really built for them. And that's why all the Brunt products are actually named after the guys that he grew up with. These might be the most comfortable work boots on the planet, but they also deliver real performance on the job. So whether you need waterproof, safety toe, soft toe, pull on, lace up, they've got you covered. They're so confident these boots will blow you away that they even let you try it on the job risk-free. So for a limited time, our listeners are getting $10 off at Brunt if you use code Dalton at checkout. All you got to do is head to bruntworkwear.com and use code DALTON at checkout for $10 off. After your purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please support the show and tell them that we sent you. Back to the show. Okay, let's take a step back even further. Likelihood-wise, construct or compromised? Which is the greater likelihood?
Was he groomed to begin with to be this? Was he seen as a potential, here's a person who's smart and amoral. Okay, he has all the right sociopathic tendencies that we can create. He starts early on. He's working at a private school in New York. Not the Dalton School.
It is. Yep.
Oh yeah. Okay. There you go. You're not named after that. So. Well, there's a question for you. Was that something that was facilitated for him? Was he placed in that position to meet the right people? Or was it something that just evolved from his context? Both of those seems to me Both perfectly feasible possibilities. Either one of those could be true. And I think that you can map out the basic facts of his career. Taught at the Dalton School. Got into some trouble. A little too friendly with some of the students. Now, the kids tended to like him, which made some adults suspicious. On the other hand, some of the parents of those kids seemed to think that he was a great guy. So, once he loses his job there, I think that's when he's invited to join an investment firm by someone who was a parent of students who were at the school. So he made friends. There were people who trusted him. What did they see in him? He then proved to be useful in the manipulation of money and coming up with tax-saving strategies, and that earned him more friends. That narrative, to me, can explain what happened. It doesn't seem to necessitate that there's an outside hand guiding all of this, but it doesn't eliminate that possibility. It's a thing we were talking about last night. People who seem to have a get out of jail free card. Is it just because they're lucky? No, it's just because the DA decided not to bring charges in this case. But when that happens over and over again, you have to raise the question, is somebody running interference for this person? Person keeps getting arrested again and again, and nothing really seems to happen. Well, it's either prosecutors and police not doing their job, and not doing it correctly, again and again, which is a possibility, or does someone basically, is a phone call made, something made and saying, let this person go. These charges will be dropped. That will disappear. You don't know. You don't see that. That's something that happens outside of view. It could happen, but you can't see it. The more it happens, the more the suspicion has to be created that there is something else which is going on. So I'd have to say that whether Epstein was created, whether he is a creation, or whether he is simply an opportunity that was created for others to exploit, those strike me as fairly even possibilities. But if someone wasn't exploiting what he had available to them, somewhere there were any number of people who weren't doing their job, if you weren't paying any attention to that. And it's similar to we were talking earlier about Jack Parsons, rocket scientist, military contracts. And I think I wrote something once that said that if Soviet intelligence didn't try to recruit him, somebody wasn't doing their job, and those people tend to do their jobs. I mean, look at it. He has all of this information. He's dealing with with very important stuff that we're really interested in. Rockets. There you go. He can source with people who worked on the Manhattan Project. And he's into sex magic and drugs and appears to be mentally unstable. What couldn't we use? I mean, if you were an intelligence officer, why wouldn't you go after this guy? He's perfect. He's as compromisable and exploitable and egotistical as hell. You could do all kinds of things with this guy. So nobody would miss that opportunity.
Okay, so going back, well, first of all, going back to a couple things, the Dalton School. Epstein was a college dropout, correct?
I can't remember I don't think he got a degree in anything.
Okay, so he has no degree. Dalton School it's in New York City, I believe, and
he had no teaching degree. That was the thing.
Right. Okay, so where I'm going with this is
it's a private school.
The Dalton School is one of the most prestigious preparatory schools in the United States. So how the hell does a guy that has no teaching experience and doesn't have a degree get a job as a teacher there? Number one. And number two, the other thing, again, when I'm thinking about compromised versus construct, the other thing that kind of weighs the balance, or seems to at least, to the side of construct is his money, right? Like, number one, where did his money come from? Number two, he's supposed to be a hedge fund manager of some sort. where there's no trading history. Where are his taxes? There's no SEC filings. Like, where is all that stuff?
He's connected with a couple of entities, financial entities that go under, but he tends to bail out of these things before that happens, which I find vaguely suspicious. He attempts to get out before everything collapses. Well, if you're gonna groom somebody for this, why him in particular? Well, he had no moral compass. That could be a portion of it. Private schools, one of the things about them is because they're private, they can hire anybody they want to do anything that they want. So they're not like public schools, same way that they can accept whatever students they want. This is something my wife, the school teacher, rails on constantly, is that private schools get to pick who they want. They get to cherry pick everything that they have, and they're not bound to all kinds of regulations. Whereas public schools, not to make a whole pitch for public schools, have to take everybody. So, and then deal with what they get. So he certainly gets richer and richer as time goes on. We're talking about Epstein here. And I think that's going to come with, he manages to impress people. Part of it is that he seems to have been quite likable. Huh? Had to be. He's ingratiating. He's a courtier. The people who can really, to a certain degree, sort of manipulate and con the more important people around them, the richer and the more powerful, like all the servants of the royal family, all right? The people who actually call the shots, okay? So, likable, fairly unobtrusive, a guy who was useful. Yeah, people liked him. There's no substitute for that in terms of just being fundamentally likable. Those people get away with everything. They'll be given opportunities that other people don't have. They'll be forgiven things that other people aren't. And it seems to have been a situation where, if nothing else, he learned how to manipulate that to his advantage. But it doesn't mean that there isn't more to it.
Okay, so as far as which intelligence agencies, again, speculation, but we talked a bit. I had a CIA officer in here, John Kiriakou, and he basically just, to sum up, he said it had, in his opinion, all the hallmarks of a Mossad access operation, right? I mean, you're not going to recruit Prince Andrew or Bill Clinton, so what's the next best thing? You recruit somebody that has access to them, even if it's, just rubbing shoulders with them, hearing about what they're up to on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't necessarily have to be getting them in compromising situations. If you happen to wire a house for audio and video and record them having sex with minors, that's another thing. But if you were to speculate about which intelligence agency or agencies, I guess maybe we could start with that, because I would have a follow-up question depending on where it goes.
Well, could the Mossad have been behind it? Well, okay. The Mossad is a relatively small intelligence agency that works for a small country, a very small country, a disproportionately powerful country in some way, but small in terms of its general resources, really, and in terms of its physical size. So one of the things that, from my perspective, influences Israeli policy in every regard is always this gnawing, unavoidable sense of vulnerability. They're always on the edge of destruction. Okay, that it is a country which, I'm not trying to make a case for or against in this. I'm just saying that Israel is a country that it would be relatively easy to wipe off the face of the map because there's not much to it. It's a fragile construction. So in that regard, you need, well, look at how Israel came into existence because of did they bring themselves into existence? Okay, some Zionists might like to believe that, but no. It was brought into existence by the UN and primarily by the United States and the other Western powers, and even the Soviets sign on, because all those larger countries thought that they could manipulate it in some way. has nothing to do with kindness or sweetness or light. All of them saw that we could create a state here that might be useful for our particular advantages. So, in a sense, Israel was created by the manipulation and use of larger, more powerful countries. And essentially, Israel then aligns itself with the West. It becomes America's giant aircraft carrier in the Middle East. But what is all of this based on? Based upon love? Based upon trust? Why would you, okay, look at it from the Israeli standpoint. You're a small, vulnerable country, and you're really kind of dependent. They're dependent on the U.S. There might be some Israelis who object to that, but yes, you are. You're dependent for arms, support. What? You would not exist without that. Other Western countries, not to a degree, but America overall is your great protector. Your guarantee from annihilation. But is that entirely dependable? You know, Americans go through revolution every 4 or 8 years. Okay? Regimes constantly change. You never know what those crazy people are going to do. And that is extremely disconcerting. So the more leverage that you can have, the more influence, let's use that word, the more influence that you can input into that state and others, the more it's useful for you. It's a matter of survival. So let's again leave aside all sort of moral questions of good or bad. It's simply a matter of survival, which is the basic thing. And what do you do to survive? Anything. So there would probably be, from the standpoint, if an intelligence service was utilizing Jeffrey Epstein as an asset and utilizing his information, I cannot think of any other service or state that would potentially find that more useful, that would have greater need, which isn't to say that it's the only one in that regard, but it could prove to be the more leverage you got over important people in the countries in which you are, whether you like it or not, you're dependent upon. And remember, dependency always creates resentment. You can't trust them because you know that they're not doing this because they love you. They're doing it because you're useful to them. So at what point does Israel become something which is useful to become something which can be sacrificed? That could happen at some point. I mean, that comes to the question of why do the Israelis have a nuclear arsenal? Because if they go down, they take everything else with them. I was actually told that once. I don't know whether it was true, and it wasn't from an authority, but if we're going down, we're just going to start launching warheads. And if you didn't, and that's what we can do. Which also, of course, they're allowed to have those. Because that whole process could have been prevented. Everybody freaks out about the Iranians getting nuclear weapons. Oddly enough, there was never any sort of freak out about Israel getting nuclear weapons. And I'm sure they actually admit they do. They have them. Everybody knows that they have them, but no one ever wants to directly confront that. I'm not saying they shouldn't have them. But that was just kind of, okay, that just happened. Oops, there's a whole nuclear arsenal there. How did that happen? Well, anyway, can't do anything about it now. No, everybody knew what they were doing. The whole thing was planned and facilitated the whole way.
Okay, so I think a big reason why a lot of people go with Mossad or assume Mossad is because of, Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father was a Mossad agent.
Mm-hmm.
But you also mentioned before about him, the possibility of him just being an entrepreneur and maybe double or triple or quadruple dipping and selling to the highest bidder. Do you think that if multiple agencies were to be involved, do you think it's more likely that that is the reason, or because he's just been compromised in general by or constructed by multiple agencies, either on their own or as a joint operation?
Well, then you get into the really murky realms. To what degree do ostensibly opposing intelligence agencies actually cooperate with each other? To some degree. Every now and then they have things they have to do together. You know, it's not impossible that even you and your adversary have another enemy or threat, a mutual threat that you would have to deal with. I don't know, aliens. But see, that's the one that would come up. But it doesn't have to be that. I think there's more of that kind of mutual exchange between even opposing intelligence organizations that goes on. That is, it's not the type of thing that's ever publicly discussed, but there's always some degree of interchange among them. They talk to each other on a particular level, even when they're friendly. But they never talk wholly. I mean, from the American standpoint, you couldn't necessarily trust the Brits entirely, right? They could be, well, they were compromised, and they could still be. And you have slightly differing agendas. They're not always the same. All you have to do is look at the Suez fracas in the 1950s. I mean, the U.S. was not interested in supporting the British return to control over the Suez Canal, even though the British wanted that. We weren't going to support them in it. So there are cases where even allies differ, and there are cases where enemies have certain points in common. And after all, they kind of know each other. They operate in the same world. They're all, on one level, professionals. You have a pretty good idea how the other side thinks. You have a pretty good idea as to what they want, how far they're willing to go. I think it's been said that one of the things that probably prevented a nuclear war during the Cold War period is that there was a good sense on both sides that nobody wanted to die. I mean, what do we want to do? We want to survive. The USSR wants to survive. The US wants to survive. Britain wants to survive. Israel wants to survive. Remember, it all comes down fundamental to survival. So what do you have to do to ensure that basic goal? Because if you don't survive, if you die, then nothing matters at that point. There's nothing more fundamentally important than that. You have to survive to achieve everything else. So that becomes the baseline. Everything has to be calculated upon that. And that entails some degree of dialogue and even understanding between opposing sides. Our ultimate general goal here is not to die. So we don't want to have a situation that arises which would create a thermonuclear war in which we all die. So we have to cooperate with each other to the degree to preserve our mutual existence. We can fight each other, everything else, but not to the point that it jeopardizes our individual survival. The Israelis are the most threatened. They're the most vulnerable. So in terms of who would be a consumer or a manipulator of Epstein's intelligence product, I'd agree that they're probably the most likely. But I wouldn't just focus my attention on them, and that it's nothing more than that.
I would have to imagine, or at least hope, that if, let's say, that the Mossad was involved, I would have to imagine that the CIA or whoever from the intelligence community was handling that would not be okay with them collecting information on people like Bill Clinton and different American citizens without them at least getting a cut of it. And that's, I guess, a whole other ball of wax, and you can go down a rabbit hole with that one on.
Well, then you get into individual agencies. which are entities. They're like a living organism. These things just continue. They're not really dependent upon. Well, let's put it this way. He was the director of Central Intelligence. Really doesn't, well, they wouldn't like that. But it doesn't matter that much. And it's going to change. But the whole organization is still there. It doesn't change the organization. You're getting thousands of people going around their jobs. Professionals, okay? People who have careers. And there was someone who was a CIA employee who once put it to me that, change in presidents doesn't really concern me. They come and go. I'm in this for a career. I'm going to be here my whole professional life. This is what I do. And I've seen this and that administration come and go, and this particular Senate committee come and go. All these people are temporary. The agency is eternal. The agency will live forever, so long as there are people like me, professionals, to do its job. So, who's at the top of the heap? Who's the next political appointee to be placed in charge of an organization that they've never been part of before? Doesn't really matter. All you have to do is wait them out. And that was that the political leadership, in a sense, didn't really matter. That wasn't the real. That wasn't even their view what the real government was. I think they were alluding to something that comes in this term of the sort of deep state idea, which is not to be scoffed at. It's a term which is overly used, but you do have all of these vast bureaucratic entities that continue, and they have the same kind of incentive that everything else does, which is to survive, to maintain their position, and to survive and grow. And any kind of information, any sort of fuel that will allow them to do that is necessary. Also think about it, that if you're a government agency which is susceptible to all of the slings and arrows of temporary political leadership, the more leverage and compromising material you have on those people, the better, isn't it? Doesn't it just make sense? You start getting some overly ambitious senator who wants to open an investigation. Well, perhaps we have some film that might come in. See, that's where coercion could be handling. Just to make people shut up.
But you just got me thinking about the relationship and how complicated it is. I mean, we worked together with the Israelis on Stuxnet, right? That was a joint American and Israeli operation. Actually, yeah, we haven't talked about that. Can you explain to people what that was?
Stuxnet it's a computer virus. And this is around turn of this century, I think, late 90s, early 2000s. The Iranians are doggedly working on their nuclear program, which involved the use of centrifuges, and Stuxnet was basically a virus, a worm, which was placed on a thumb drive, which somebody plugged into one of the Iranian facilities, and it then spread throughout the whole system, and it made the centrifuges go crazy and break themselves, thus setting back. It could go in and can manipulate device control software. And the narrative about that is that it was a joint creation of CIA and Mossad. Who sort of took the lead on this is difficult to say. But yes, it was to their interest to cooperate in that regard. So who actually invented it? Where did it come from? Well, the point is that it set back the Iranian nuclear program, and it was just as simple as that.
A win for everybody.
Yes.
And then you have on the other side of the coin things like, I think it's pretty common knowledge. The Israelis spy on us, and just as we spy on them, and just as everybody spies on each other, and it's one big gentleman's game.
You don't trust each other.
Yeah. But wasn't there, what was his name? Jonathan Pollard?
Yeah.
What was his story again? He was
Navy. Turned over a lot of classified information to Mossad, which the U.S. was very displeased about. The argument that you tend to get is, he was turning it over to our allies. This was, You can make that argument. Institutionally, I don't think that works very well. You took an oath that you weren't supposed to do this. You knew that you were supplying it elsewhere, and you got caught. So, what's your next excuse?
It could be worse.
It could be worse. Unless the Israelis decide to sell that information to somebody else. And if it's to their remember, if it's to their interests, who was it? Winston Churchill, if nothing else, always came up with that. This is supposedly came from him. It may have been someone else. Is that nations don't have friends; they have interests. People have friends. Nations have interests, and those interests can change. But there's no such thing as friendship. This is a kind of, the U.S. and Britain have a special relationship, which means that they're dependent upon us, and we use a lot of their programs on PBS. That type of, there's a connection between the two, but that also creates resentments of one kind or another. Try that in a British pub after everybody's had a few drinks. Then try to find out how they really feel about the U.S. I mean, there's always this kind of love-hate relationship. And you can work the same thing in terms of how Americans really feel about the Brits. They're nice. They're passive-aggressive. They're masters at being passive-aggressive. They can insult you with the most sincere politeness.
And humor.
But you're still being insulted. That's just you got to strike back in some way or another. But it creates complicated relationships between societies and between peoples and governments themselves. And it's all changeable. So again, it comes back that ultimately it doesn't come down to friendships. It comes down to interests. It comes down to a matter of survival. And if survival is in question, then all of this friendly stuff goes out the windows.
Okay, so just to come back to the Epstein stuff and wrap it up, again, as a speculative thought experiment, let's say you're CIA director and you have this Jeffrey Epstein character to mold. Something I've thought about is, now, if you were to, do you think that an agency like that would think that his pedophilia problem, if they found out about it, would they view it as a positive that could be leveraged into, things like we're talking about, those outcomes? Or do you think that they would view it as a possible red flag and a shortcoming that would rear its head down the road? Does that make sense?
Well, how useful is it? If you found it too morally reprehensible to deal with, you never would have approached it to begin with, because that should have been obvious fairly early on. Okay, it didn't take you all those years to figure out that he likes young girls, a little too young. That, of course, is a cultural thing, but we'll get it. With our culture, that's some places that wouldn't be that unusual. In some places, polygamy isn't that unusual, but generally it's frowned upon in polite Western society. So that couldn't have come as a surprise to anyone. And those predilections from the standpoint of exploitation and manipulation could be useful. Creates a dirty little secret he has to keep covered up. You got something on him. I mean, there has to be a certain portion of that. He can't have the monopoly on having things on things on everyone else, what I'm trying to say. So it helps to manipulate him. Again, just do the math of the situation. Looking at it as opposed to a kind of moral conundrum. I mean, my God, if you're in the game of intelligence, it's not to say that moral considerations couldn't come into it, but you kind of left those down the road some time ago, didn't you? I mean, that's, again, when it comes down to a matter of survival, that's no longer a question. What's moral or immoral in terms of survival? So it's just a matter of being realistic. I have to add in here someplace that I've done other podcasts, and while I generally don't go through a podcast and read comments because that's a road to madness, there have been ones where I have been accused of being some sort of apologist for the government or for, one thing or another. And just to say that I don't work for these people. I don't have anything there. I just don't want to try to push conclusions that I don't know are true. And if I say that I'm not certain about something, that's all that I mean. I'm not trying to make excuses for them or Epstein or anything. It could be a lot of things. Epstein's career is highly suspicious, and it almost certainly was manipulated, or should have been, by an intelligence agency of one form or another. You take the pick as to which ones you want to put in the lead. So, but that's about as much as I think you can fairly, clearly say about the situation. And even that is a form of speculation. I think speculation with a lot of weight behind it. But that's what you need to have. So no, I'm not working for the government. Which government would that be? Or for the Illuminati? No, not for them either.
Oh.
But if I was, I wouldn't tell you. So there you go. See?
Well, if you're going to read my comments, then I am also a CIA plant, and this is a CIA-sponsored podcast, and just what they want you to hear, which is ironic because my first guest was a CIA dissident who blew the whistle on the enhanced interrogation program.
Well, that just proves that you're trying to
do with that with you will.
All right. It just don't read the comments.
Yeah, that's the moral of the story.
Yeah.
And again, I think the way I meant to phrase my question was not, again, it wasn't about morality. It was about, like, if an agency was to construct a person to compromise others, would they see that proclivity for disgusting things as a positive, or would that be something that could fuck them in some way? You know what I mean? Like, I phrased it the wrong way.
It could be both, but you'd have to weigh those. These are flaws that could be, or predilections that could be exploited in a positive way. First of all, this guy's not going to have any predilections about, or any, his predilections will incline him to compromising others. He's not going to be afraid to go there. With this a guy who could set up a Lolita Island? Yeah, okay, because he's already into that type of thing to begin with. So does it mean that any kind of association with him later on could become embarrassing? Well, that's why we kill him. I mean, that, I think, could explain a number of things. So first of all, you keep your distance. Can't prove anything. And he's dead. His girlfriend is still alive, which is interesting. So one could speculate, and this is actually, what kind of deal did she cut? Maybe nothing. Maybe she's entirely innocent.
Well, she's in apparently she's in a dormitory now already, which is, I don't recall what prison she's at, but relatively speaking, that is a cushy arrangement.
Do you suppose there was a deal made there somewhere? You think that's a possibility that some sort of deal was made, that she had something to negotiate with? So that's the thing that most strikes me. She's still alive. He's not.
Where would you go with that? If you were to, again, speculate.
If I was to speculate, I'd say that she was maybe a little more careful or proactive about keeping a certain amount of information available that she could use to negotiate with. I mean, she went into hiding. Eventually, she gives herself up. They work out a kind of deal. Arguably, some sort of payment was made. Something was delivered or withheld. And, if she's lucky, she's still alive. It's a huge advantage. Remember, everything is about survival. She survived. Jeffrey did not.
Okay, so yeah, let's wrap up with his death then. So, a lot of people say that his death and the circumstances of it really don't matter as much as everything else. And like, I understand that point, but I think that it obviously matters because, again, if you're thinking about, let's say that he didn't kill himself. Let's say that somebody killed him. The question becomes who, right? Not why. I think the why is fairly obvious, and or at least the directions to go down around the why. But in terms of who has the kind of access to cut the cameras, to go into a prison like that that's already highly secure, and that I think there was no suicides or any incidents like that in the past 10 years prior, and make something like that happen, right? Is it an American agency? Is it a foreign agency? Like the implications around the answer to that question, I think, are interesting, if not important, at least interesting. Could it like, was it just some American spook that goes in there and flashes a badge and says national security, or is it much more elaborate than that? That's a pretty unprecedented level of access.
Who killed him? Well, okay, let's speculate. Let's go with I think most likely scenario to me, and there are those that would disagree, that he was murdered, that it was not a suicide, just get so despondent, kill himself. That's could happen. It would be one or more persons who had particular skill sets, which people do. So what did happen? Well, the cameras were supposed to be functioning, and they weren't functioning. There were supposed to be other people who would have seen what was happening, and they weren't there. A whole set of unlikely circumstances occurred by which his death could happen, and there's no record of it, where there should have been. Those circumstances themselves, they're anomalous. A set of anomalous circumstances in the operation of that whole detention center happened to allow his death to occur out of sight. And, without the cameras and recording that were so essential to the type of thing that he would have done. Arranging that would have been difficult, but not impossible, because it happened. It either happened one of two ways. It either happened through a string of extremely unlikely accidents, or it happened because it was deliberately planned that way. Which is more likely? To get that result, which is more likely? That it was just a bunch of weird things that just happened at that particular time, just at the time this guy is going to off himself, all of these other things stop functioning, or that is all planned that way. The planning is much easier to explain. And how does it work? Well, again, you've got people who have the skill sets to do it, to manipulate everything from software to that. And then there are other people who can be, you want to involve as few people in it as possible. But you can also pay people off, threaten them, divert their attention. The best way to do it is to use people without them knowing they were ever used. So nothing there that couldn't have been arranged, because it was arranged. I mean, it's not like the possibility could this happen? It happened. So it was either a freak accident, a series of freak accidents, all occurring simultaneously, or it was a planned operation.
Has anyone heard from the prison guards or the people that were supposed to be responsible for the cameras and guarding a cell? I can't remember.
I've never seen anything from them. There may be, but what are they going to say? Things break down. Usually it's a spokesman for the agency of the group who's talking about it. You don't try to involve individual people there. You wouldn't find very much. And it could be entirely possible those people didn't know what was going on.
So we started talking about MK Ultra a little bit earlier, and you've done some research on Charles Manson and the Manson family. And we were talking a bit last night in the car. Again, we have some younger viewership and people that maybe just weren't necessarily up to speed on all the details of the case. And with things now like Tom O'Neill's documentary that we've both seen coming out, I think it was last month. There's new details on the case, and so I guess a good place to start was or could be what has been like your research into the Manson family, like who's Charles Manson, who's the Manson family, and maybe just give us a foundation and we can start to go down that rabbit hole.
Okay, so for the uninitiated, Charles Manson is everybody's scary, murderous hippie. Okay, the guy who turned the peace, love, and happiness into fear, and dread, murder. Um, Even though calling Manson a hippie is a bit much, the fellow who killed off the counterculture in some respects by going to that kind of dark side. Cult leader, something else he's often called. Charles Manson was essentially a career petty criminal, a person of no particular note or achievement even in his criminal career. I mean, he'd stolen cars, made a very unsuccessful attempt to be a pimp, but keep that in mind because that's basically what he'll revive later on. Credit card for, minor stuff, in and out of juvenile hall and prison, but it was also in prison where, for a while he studied everything from theosophy to Scientology. In fact, while in prison at one point, he actually, when asked about his religion, said he was a Scientologist. So yes, he was read Dianetics and was a believer in it for a while. He said, but then he's a criminal. Also learned how to play the guitar. Befriended a variety of people. I think one of his first prison friends and mentor was an avowed Satanist. Make of that what you will, but and maybe too much one shouldn't make out of it. But nothing remarkable about the guy. You wouldn't think much. A jailbird for the most part. Nothing, physically a fairly small guy. There seems to be this weird disagreement as to whether or not he was 5'2", 5'4", or 5'6". Can't someone measure him? I mean, true, he could fold himself small enough he could fit into a cabinet later on when he was captured, but physically not a he wasn't a particularly imposing specimen. He was kind of a little wiry guy, but again, he seems to have had a certain amount of charisma, mostly because he could play guitar, and he could actually, in my jaundiced opinion, sing reasonably well. I didn't know that because I'd always heard that he would do these horrible songs and he wanted to be a rock star, but he couldn't compose music. No, it's not bad. But you only realize that if you listen to it and they don't tell you that it's Charlie Manson. Okay. If you didn't know it was Charlie Manson, it's not that bad. Not great, but there have been far worse. Okay, he can carry a tune, he can play the guitar, and that was good with girls. And he was apparently fairly charming in that regard. And again, early on, he wasn't a very successful pimp, but he had some skills at manipulating women. I think he had a particular means of doing it. There's some guys that can, and there's some that can't. And Charlie seemed to have the ability to do it. He's a lot older than most of the sort of, runaways and hippie kids that he will hang out with in his 30s, but he tends to look, he grows his hair out, wears sort of mod clothes and the rest of it. He affects the kind of look, but it's a look that he affects. It's not really part of him. Charlie Manson is really fundamentally a kind of hick petty criminal con man, jailbird. So what I see is that there's this strange change in his career up to that point. He's been in and out of jail. So I think it's early 67. He gets out of Terminal Island federal prison, and he's on parole. So as the first I think, he's supposed to report to his parole officer, and that would be in LA County. That's where he was released, Southern California. Doesn't do that. Instead, goes north to the Bay Area, hundreds of miles away, up to San Francisco, where Haight-Ashbury and the whole scene is going on. I could see why he might be attracted to that. Not that there wasn't plenty of potential criminal enterprise or in the music industry that he was interested in, that he wanted to break into, is in LA. It's not so much in San Francisco. So he goes to San Francisco. Eventually, I think 2 weeks after he arrives there, he eventually goes in to report for his parole. Well, what should have happened at that point? What would normally happen to someone who was on parole and shows up weeks later in another city? he would be on a bus back to Terminal Island. But no, that doesn't happen. He gets assigned a parole officer. I mean, maybe they were just feeling generous that day. And the parole officer he gets, I think the guy's name is Michael Smith, which is an interesting guy. So he's a federal parole officer. He's also a graduate student in psychology at UC California, studying group dynamics and the influence of drugs on criminal gangs. Those are the things he's particularly interested in. And also has connections to the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, which is an area where Charlie Manson will frequent with his growing little coterie of female followers. And then the situation gets stranger because normally parole officer would be supervising a group of parolees. You know, it's not like one person, but Smith's job is eventually reduced down to just supervising one parolee, and that's Charles Manson. Because apparently he's got other sort of grad student things to do. But that's odd. And what it eventually looks like, if you stand back, is that Smith is using Manson as a kind of lab rat. So again, he's very interested in drugs, group dynamics. Charlie Manson is organizing a group. He's using a lot of drugs. It's all connected to the free clinic. And he's also gets this kind of get out of jail free card. I mean, as a parolee, there's all kinds of things he's not supposed to do. You're not supposed to consort with other criminals. He does. You're not supposed to. He's hanging around with a lot of underage girls. Okay, he gets away with a lot of stuff. Nothing happens. And this is a pattern that will go throughout his fairly short-lived career as cult leader, which is to follow. Does it get busted? Usually in not terribly major crimes. There are, car theft. The most famous instance of that is later when he's based down in L.A. and the L.A. sheriff's raids the Spawn Ranch and goes in and rounds up the place. And what do you find there? All these runaways, underage girls, stolen cars. Manson has stolen credit cards on his person. And what eventually happens to him? He gets cut loose. All the charges get dropped because somebody misdated a warrant, supposedly. Except as far as nobody seems to be able to find that original misdated warrant. So it was either just a huge snafu, somebody fucked up, or there was a get out of jail free card. So if you begin to line up all of those things, if you begin to collect those particular data points, the simple explanation, which isn't always the correct one to me, is that from the time he got out of Terminal Island, perhaps why he was paroled to begin with, by this time, by the way, he'd become a kind of model prisoner, is that he'd been recruited as an informant. So I think the whole reason that he didn't show up, he didn't report for parole in L.A. is because he was basically told to go to San Francisco, and he was directed right to Michael Smith, who was exactly the type of person he was supposed to work with, who then becomes his controller. And Manson now becomes a kind of lab rat informer, dealing with the whole kind of underground counterculture which is going on in San Francisco. And he provided information, and in return for that, he was allowed to go about his business largely unmolested. And then he moves his operation back down to Southern California, tries to break into the music industry, which he does to a degree. I mean, the Beach Boys do record one of his songs. He people later on who wanted to claim they had nothing to do with him did have things to do with him. He does have a certain presence there. There were a lot of people in and around the music industry and then also on the edge of the film industry who knew about him and who dealt with him. And why did they deal with him? Because he deals in drugs and sex. So Manson established relationships with drug dealers. Gary Hinson was one of those. Musician who also manufactured meth in his basement. Manson then took that meth and sold it to bikers who used it and distributed it. The Straight Satans and other biker gangs. So he establishes this relationship with them. The other thing he does is he forms this, what is called the family, Occult, for lack of use just an operative term. We got lots of teenage runaways, male and female, but Charlie's mostly interested in, he did have a particular penchant for what he liked to call jailbait, which I guess he picked up in jail. So that was, he had all of the young stuff that he wanted was available, and which he then made available to others. So there were occasions where he would essentially pay the bikers by simply having the girls give them sex. Later on, when the family would set up a base at Spawn Movie Ranch, which was an old sort of Western set, sort of out on what was on the edge of L.A., in Chatsworth. It was owned by an old guy by the name of George Spahn. And, why did George Spahn let all these hippies hang out there? Well, because Squeaky Frommie was, told to sleep with him. And she kept George Spahn happy, and he let them stay there. Everybody got what they wanted in that regard. So, at the simplest, Manson's an informant. And he's an informant. And notice what he's dealing with. He's dealing with biker gangs, drugs, the flow of those drugs into the music industry, into the film industry, all types of things that, if nothing else, law enforcement was interested in collecting information on. Information that could be both used to prosecute for the purpose of criminal prosecution, but then also for the purpose of further manipulation. That is, to use compromising information to get other people, directors, producers, music stars, whatever they were, to cooperate. There seems to be this endless interest in collecting more informants. The idea is that you always use the low, get the low level of informant, you turn the petty criminal into an informant over Mr. Big so that you can eventually, we know how the movies work in that regard. Although in many ways, to me, it just looks like it's the creation of this network of information that can be used to, well, sometimes to go after people and sometimes not. In the process of that, though, it means that all the criminals that you've recruited as informants, as useful criminals, get to go about their criminal activities. So society is no longer being protected from them. Arguably, they're not terribly dangerous, but they get to go on doing this. And if Manson runs into trouble, the trouble tends to go away. So altogether, Manson seems to me, and I could be wrong, the science could be, the tea leaves may not mean what they do, or seem to do, is that he's an informant. The question is, he's an informant for who? Who's really interested in this stuff? Doesn't seem to be the LA sheriffs. Not sure it's the LAPD. Those are two different, the sheriff's department, the police department. Then you've got lots of other cities and police departments. If I was to speculate, I'd say it's probably the feds, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, later what will become the DEA. There was a lot of suspicion over, well, keep in mind, this is 68, 69, 70, the sort of height of the counterculture. A lot of people in authority don't like what's going on. All these long-haired hippie musicians writing music for long-haired hippies and everything else, which is kind of, it's a type of thing that is both threatening, but if it's threatening, you have to kind of manage it and control it to a certain degree. And Manson, I think, was a recruit, was an informant, and a kind of agent of influence. That's another term that we haven't mentioned, the idea of the agent of influence. The agent of influence isn't really a spy. They're simply a person who's, well, we have this whole group of people today on the internet called influencers. Why don't you just call them propagandists? That's what the term actually is. An influencer. Okay, and people will, I'm going to become an influencer. I'm going to sign on to become a propagandist for something. So at least we acknowledge what they're actually doing. They're just influencing people. So an agent of influence is, think of it this way, somebody who would go to parties and cultivate the right people and talk about the right things and bring in certain ideas or move the conversation in certain directions. And generally, they would be admired and liked and respected by other people around them, or at least liked, and that's how they managed to influence them. So then the whole thing comes down to the murders. All of this would have gone fine, except people started getting murdered. So the drug dealing, okay, the essentially the human trafficking that Manson was involved in. What he had a lot of teenage runaways, especially young female runaways, and he began sort of picking up these girls in the Bay Area, and then that continued down south, and so he had sort of male henchmen who were a part of that. The Bobby Beausoleils, Tex Watson, and the rest of them. But the male influence that Manson exercised was over young females. And you could say that the family became a cult in the sense that, well, how do you define a cult? What is a cult other than a religion that you don't belong to and you dislike and doesn't have many followers? Well, the key element to me in a cult, if we're going to go for a definition, is that there is someone at the top who exercises an extremely powerful psychological influence over their followers. And you find that in a lot of religious or religious-like groups. But in cults, that tends to be very strong. And to the point that the person seems to have an almost Svengali-like control over them. And in Manson's case, his charisma was amplified by the use of psychedelics, particularly LSD again, which was apparently consumed on a regular, if not almost daily basis in and around the family, which kept everyone in an altered state and aided in that manipulation. And what could that possibly have to do with things that were learned through MK Ultra? I don't know. Maybe. I'm just saying that there's a certain similarity there. How can we take these ideas and apply them to... And what was it that Michael Smith was looking... Oh, yeah, the effect of drugs on group dynamics. And then his sole parolee goes on to form a group which is largely dominated by drugs. Interesting how these things work out. So the killings, there are two sets of them, all occur on my birthday, the 9th and the 10th of August, 1969. So, yes, while I was celebrating my birthday, Charlie Manson's hench girls were killing Sharon Tate. So I've never thought about it that way, but anyway. So you've got the killings on Cielo Drive, which do not work out the way they did in the Tarantino film. And then the next night you have the killings over on Waverly Place of the La Biancas, a couple, and very different groups of people. So the first 4 people, you've got Sharon Tate, who is the beautiful pregnant actress who's the wife of director Roman Polanski, who's conveniently out of town while all of this is going on. And then 3 of her friends, Wojtek Frykowski, who was a Polish friend, other sort of film, and also a drug dealer, which is kind of interesting, to make money, because his films are more difficult. And Abigail Folger, coffee heiress, who's a friend of Sharon Tate, and then Jay Sebring, who was one of her former boyfriends, who was just kind of hanging out there, Sharon Tate's former boyfriends. And they're all butchered by some of Manson's, a group of his followers, and I think that's Tex Watson, Susan Atkins. I used to be able to name all of them, Patricia Krenwinkel. And so essentially they kill the caretaker, they go to this, and Sharon Tate is stabbed to death, her 8th-month baby dies, everyone else is killed. It's an extremely bloody killing with certain ritualistic aspects that are involved in it. And then the next night they go over, supposedly now keep in mind, Manson is not there. He's not personally involved. He is miles away from Cielo Drive when Sharon Tate and her friends are killed. he is supposedly present and actually goes into the house of where the LaBiancas are killed the following night. Now, Lino LaBianca is a partner in a grocery store chain, and his wife runs a dress store, a kind of boutique. I mean, they're not like the whole sort of, Sharon Tate is an actress, and everyone else there is sort of on the edge of the beautiful people in Hollywood. So what do they have in common with this grocer and his wife? Well, they're both killed by members of the Manson family. So I don't think that the LaBiancas get the attention that they probably should. And one of the things that I'll sort of steer away from Sharon Tate. So Sharon Tate is an actress. The other people are all there because they're friends of hers. Frykowski is a friend of her husband who is involved in drug dealing. So remember, Manson's involved in drug dealing. And now you've got the element of drugs with Frykowski as well. It may all have been about him. You get different stories that, that Manson was a frustrated musician. There had been a music producer named Terry Melcher who had lived in that same house sometimes earlier. And the story you'll often hear is that he'd welched on a record deal with Manson, and then Manson, long after the fact, has just decided that everybody who lived in the house should be killed. Does that make any sense? Especially since Terry Melcher wasn't living there and Manson knew he wasn't living there. Members of Manson and his family had visited the house before. They'd swum in the pool. Because Manson, in addition to supplying drugs, is supplying young girls to people. Kind of Epstein-like. And that's one of the things that he was doing. He was trading in drugs and sex. You wanted a lot of young runaway hippie girls to show up at your party? Charlie could arrange that for you. And they would all do it happily. So there is this kind of connection between Manson and the Cielo house that implies some sort of earlier relationship. The LaBiancas are harder to figure, but here's the thing that I found interesting once I started looking at it. You don't have to look very far to find it. Lino LaBianca was a partner in a family-owned chain of supermarkets, small chain of supermarkets. He didn't own them. It was a family enterprise, but he had been managing them. And I guess the simplest way to describe it is he'd been stealing from the family business. He'd been, skimming money off the markets. That had been discovered, I think, by his mother, who essentially ran the thing. I think, and one of his brothers had caught on to this. His financial irregularities were going to catch up with him. Why was he doing this? Because he owed money. So here you have to figure, how does a middle-aged businessman, get himself into debt where he's going to have to embezzle tens of thousands of dollars from the family business? How does that work? Well, it's usually either gambling or drugs. Even a mistress usually isn't that expensive. So, gambling or drugs, which would then mean contact with, well, there's the drug angle again. Okay, we know that Charlie's involved with the whole drug distribution. And then there's, gambling, that potentially organized crime. Not that the fact that LaBiancas were Italian has anything to do with that, but it doesn't help. All right, there's just one more little thing to bring into it. One tiny step closer. And so he owes money, which he has a difficult. Now, here's one of the odd things. LaBianca's wife, Rosemary, had ran a rather successful business. She was actually more successful than her husband. She was a former waitress that he married, which then did quite well. And she'd started this kind of stylish boutique where apparently Sharon Tate and Abigail Folger were occasional customers. That's a kind of link, maybe. I'm not sure anybody I've never seen anything that would positively identify them as having coming and bought dresses there, but seemed to have known people in common. That might have been one point where they had touched bases. But she had lots of money. And he in this case, Lino LaBianca had apparently asked her for money and she turned him down. So he was getting kind of desperate. So there's a guy who has some sort of financial problems, and he's going to get caught, possibly prosecuted, if nothing else, get kicked out of the family business. There's a crisis brewing somewhere, and I can't help but think that somehow that is going to influence his eventual fate. Maybe he owed money to the mob, maybe he owed money to drug dealers, maybe other members of his family decided that they wanted to get rid of him. Which brings up the possibility that some have proposed that the killings, what actually connects them is that Manson had another sideline, which was murder for hire. And that he and his family were simply hired to whack these people for different reasons. There were some people who wanted Forkovsky, or there's no particular reason why they would want Sharon Tate dead. I mean, she doesn't seem to be, but there could have been other people there they might have wanted killed. In the case of the LaBiancas, maybe there was someone who wanted them killed, and by carrying out these two killings, and by the way, leaving marks behind. This is the whole thing where you get into the death to piggies, the helter-skelter angle that was then used by the prosecution. So the killings would then take place, and you would leave what were supposed to look like, that what they were trying to do, theoretically, in a very inept way, was blame it all on the Black Panthers. Okay, blame it on some black guys. There we'll go. We'll carry out these killings of rich piggies, and we'll make it look like the Black Panthers did it, which will then, disinformation, which will lead the police off in a completely different direction, and will seemingly link the crimes together. Because you're committing murders on alternate nights of two very different groups of people, but you're leaving behind deliberate signs that link the killings together. So the murder for hire thing is one possibility. I don't see any other particular evidence to support that, but and then there's another thing that comes in. If you take it back, if you look at the events that precede it, and this is often, it's one of those things that in terms of historical or criminal investigations you've got to do, besides the event itself and what follows, you need to look at what precedes it. You also need to look at what else is happening at the same time, because there can be connections between these. So there was the musician who, how am I getting his name right? Hinman. There we go. We'll get it that way. Think of Jim Henson. That's what the Muppets. We got to get the Muppets out of my head. All right. So Gary Hinman, musician, sometimes musician, apparently a pretty good one, and drug manufacturer. And Manson had got some meth from him, which he then sold to the bikers. And apparently the bikers came back and complained that this was a bad batch and that a number of their brothers had gotten very, very sick on this, and they wanted their $2,000 back. Manson gave them their $2,000. And then he sent, I think, Bobby Beausoleil and a couple of the girls over to Hinman's house in order to collect from him, because now you owe me the money that I had to pay for the bad batch you gave me. And now this is before any of the other killings. And Hinman denies that there was anything wrong with this. Things tend to get out of control. The whole idea was initially they were just supposed to, torture him to get the money, and they end up killing him. And they also knew that Hinman sold drugs to the Black Panthers or people connected with that. So that's where the whole sort of first, what looked like tiger paws and messages written in blood show up. And then what happens is that Bobby Beausoleil takes Hinman's car, drives it up the coast in some sort of drug-fueled road trip, along with the bloody knife in the car that he killed Hinman with, parks it by the side of the road, and falls asleep. The cops show up and bust him and find him in a stolen car belonging to a murdered man with a murder weapon in the car. Doesn't look good for Bobby. So he's arrested and charged with murder. And apparently Bobby was very popular at the ranch and popular with some of the girls. Another argument is that the other murders were done as copycat murders to get Bobby Beausoleil out of jail. Because if he's in custody and there are other people out there, Black Panthers, whoever they are, going around killing people, well, then obviously his story about, I stole the car, but I didn't know the knife was in it, and I don't know this guy, that I'm a car thief, but I'm not a murderer, might hold up. So that could explain the whole thing. I know that's not the most tantalizing explanation, but there again, you can come up with a narrative that would work. That the other killings were committed in order to throw suspicion away from Bobby Beausoleil and get him out of jail. But that doesn't mean that that's all there is to it. It could also be the idea of that the Manson was using, that's could also be a good way to carry out some contract murders and make them all somehow, to combine to multitask, to connect these things together. And then there are the unlimited number of other series. There's the whole story that Roman Polanski, and I repeat, this is a story. The Roman Polanski was making specialty films for specialty clients, and those were essentially porn films and snuff films. And those were being filmed and distributed, and that's also what was being, that this was actually, the murder was aimed at his wife in order to send a message to him, unless they thought that he was going to be there. So people can come up with all sorts of reasons, not necessarily, reasons of various plausibility as to why the murders occurred. The facts, the murders occurred. These people were killed. They were killed by members of the Manson family. Charles Manson wasn't there. He didn't actually kill anyone. And if you look at the subsequent trial, you got a grandstanding DA. There seem to be a lot of those, Vincent Bugliosi, who then decides he's going to build his whole case around the helter-skelter thesis. And the helter-skelter thesis was that Charles Manson was an evil, hippie, madman, genius, criminal, who seduced and manipulated all of these young people and mesmerized them with this idea of an apocalyptic race war that was going to take place. And he and his followers were going to, in which they were going to build a kind of secret base out in the Mojave Desert. And they were going to hide out, and they were going to weather the war. And once all the angry whites and blacks had sort of killed each other, whatever was left, then they were going to come out and they were going to rule over the apocalyptic ruins. Sound familiar? Seen that in a movie somewhere, right? So that was the basis at the trial as to why the killings took place. And that was the whole story as to how Manson manipulated the followers into committing these murders. But I think, as Tom O'Neill points out pretty well, that's not really, within the Manson family itself, that was never a big deal. The only person who makes a big deal of the helter-skelter thesis is Vincent Bugliosi, who pretty much invents this whole thing, because he had to come up with some sort of story, because he has to turn Manson into this evil, manipulating Svengali, who also has a completely crazy story behind it. There's a lot of interesting stuff. I mean, Manson, there's really not much evidence against him. He's convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder, despite the fact that there's no physical evidence connecting him to either crime. The key witness, one of the girls turns Linda Kasabian. I think is the one who turns state's evidence. Well, Susan Atkins did that initially, and then she recanted. But, you got people who are accused, who are involved in the murders. They admit it. Susan Atkins is the one who admits to killing Sharon Tate, who now, in return for reduced charges, is willing to say that Charlie Manson made me do it. That's not always the most convincing of things. I mean, anybody who's let off on a lesser charge in terms of pointing the blame at someone else, defense can make something out of that. This person is lying. There's no physical evidence to connect my client to the crime. There's just the testimony of a person who's being rewarded for that testimony. Had Charlie Manson behaved like a normal human being during the trial, I think he might actually have gotten off. But instead, he just acts like the most, he plays the role exactly as Vincent Bugliosi would written. You know, he's got others of his girls who show outside the courtroom. At one point, they all carve crosses and swastikas into their forehead. They engage in all kinds of bizarre antics. He gives, malicious stares at the jury. In fact, one of the things that Bugliosi was afraid of was that Manson would use his hypnotic mojo eyes to turn the jury in his favor. So he didn't want him looking at the jury. This was the only way to stop them from doing that. The trial turns into a circus. He's convicted, spends the rest of his life in prison, where periodically he makes more bizarre statements. So Manson is thus turned into one of the foundational villains of modern American history. And it's still a question to me as to exactly how he earns that status and why he plays the role. The real mystery to me is that the case against Manson was not particularly strong or believable, so long as he didn't play into the part. But that's what he did. And I don't know why he did that. Because I don't actually think that he was crazy or that stupid. He was cunning, if nothing else. It was based on survival. One idea is that he spent most of his life in prison and he knew he was going to go back there. And so, you don't have to worry about Social Security. If you get life in prison, all your meals and board is taken care of. So maybe that wasn't so bad. Maybe some sort of deal was cut. You have to essentially go along with this. If he had been a protected informant up to that point, why was that protection now withdrawn? Or maybe it wasn't. Keep in mind, he was initially sentenced to death, and then California got rid of the death penalty, which everybody knew was coming. So he never actually suffers an ultimate penalty for his crimes. So it sort of entered the realm of modern true-crime myth in terms of what was really going on. And there's a lot of weird stuff going on in the background of this. I think one of the people that Tom O'Neill discovered, whose name I had encountered in a different context before, or so I was surprised to see it, is a very strange sort of Hollywood hanger-on by the name of Reeve Whitson, who later seems to have connections to what? Where does he later show up? Oh, yeah, working for the CIA in Central America, allegedly. Mysterious guy who, if he wasn't an intelligence operative, he was a criminal. What's the difference? I mean, how can you always tell the difference between those two? A lot of strange antics between that. And Reeve Whitson is the guy who apparently knew about the Cielo Drive, the Sharon Tate killings, before the housekeeper showed up and discovered the bodies. Somebody was there before the bodies were technically discovered, who then didn't tell the police. So why these people were killed, precisely what Manson's involvement is in it, why the prosecution went in the direction it did, why Manson behaved in the way that he did, are all still questions about this. There you go.
Well, that's a good way to sum it all up. Had anyone heard from Whitson and his whereabouts and tried to tie up that loose end, or at least get an answer to some of those questions?
Well, Whitson seems to have done a disappearing. The only time I heard that name, this is why the name rang a bell with me, is that in the early 70s, I was living in Isla Vista, California, which was kind of the student area next to UC Santa Barbara. There was a big riot that happened there. They burned a Bank of America a couple of years before that. And a kind of student uprising, which earned it brief notoriety. And there was a kind of radical presence which was there. And that's where I heard the name Reeve Whitson mentioned as a supposed police or federal agent that was active in the area. And I don't think there are two. It could be a completely different Reeve Whitson. So it would make sense in a way that he would then go from, 50 miles from Hollywood and LA, then to operating in Isla Vista. But that's why the name rang a bell.
Okay, so yeah, then going back to Manson's Fed connections, I know you mentioned DEA as a possibility, but I mean, you would think, what he was doing at Spawn Ranch, and that he got the girls and the men to follow him like a god, and as you mentioned, do things like carve the X's into their foreheads at trial, and even again, like, get them to kill on his behalf. And so if you think about it, wasn't that exactly what the CIA was going for with MK Ultra? And in addition, getting the girls to just take LSD all day, take the clocks out of the house. And again, like, wasn't that what they were going for in terms of trying to investigate this idea of a possible Manchurian candidate and experiment with LSD and mind control? Wasn't that exactly what they were going for?
You mean, was the Manson family an off-the-shelf experiment, somewhat like the Servants of Awareness we were talking about earlier, that was subsidized to see what would happen without any accountability? No real fingerprints, no agency connections, nothing direct in this way. Lab rats. Manson's a lab rat. Michael Smith picks him out as a useful lab rat, a fellow who can be used to manipulate other young Renoites and get them to do. He had charisma. He had an ability to get people to do what he wanted and add drugs to it. The other thing that Charlie Manson studied in prison was hypnosis, interestingly enough. And the two key elements in the MK Ultra experiments were drugs and hypnosis, usually used in combination. And what they're really trying to do in this, we don't know exactly, because almost all the records of MK Ultra and its many subsidiary and allied programs, there's MK Search, there's MK Naomi, there's a whole variety of them. MK Ultra as a term sort of begins to be phased out in the early 60s, and MK Search becomes the main one, but they're still doing the same thing. So keep in mind, this fits into the time period. It doesn't technically end until 73. Although, I guarantee you it never really ended. Okay, the name ended, but those same experiments went on. Why not? You just learn how not to make anything official about it. You don't want anything that's traceable back to a government agency. No one should be there. Should all be quite distanced from it. It's all just a bunch of weirdos doing weird stuff, which you're providing the drugs and expertise for in some cases. But that's what a lot of this stuff, the whole purpose of experiment is that you try something and see what happens to it. So what can people be induced to do? How thoroughly can control them? And what all of this hypnosis and drug stuff is really about, people always talk about the Manchurian candidate assassin. That's one aspect of it. But the other part of it is just to see whether you can control people, particularly without them being aware that they're being controlled. The architecture, I think one way it was put is to understand the architecture of the human mind and then how to reassemble that architecture. And that idea had been around. There was an FBI, I should have brought this with me. I brought it to another interview, but it was an FBI memo from 1949. 1949, 2 years after the CIA was created, 4 years before MK Ultra technically exists, although there were earlier programs, Project Artichoke, Bluebird, Chatter. Those were all they were just prequels. It's the same program under different names. But it describes a meeting in 1949 at the New York apartment of a fellow by the name of Alfred Loomis, who was a scientist and researcher who did contract work for the government. But it's in a private home. And there were a group of people there, It's all part of, it was technically a meeting of what was called the Biological Warfare Committee, or Special Committee on Biological Warfare. And what they meant by biological warfare, we tend to think of it as involving germs. Well, no, what they're talking about is anything involving biological entities, the use of living things in warfare. So there are two CIA guys there, one of whom is Cleve Baxter. Cleve Baxter is Mr. Lie Detector. Almost everything in terms of the science, if there is one of lie detectors today, comes from Cleve Baxter. He's also the guy that thought plants could feel, which was part of the extension of his work with the lie detector. So you got Baxter, you got the other guy, and they're giving this kind of briefing on research that they'd been doing, and parts of the report are redacted, so you can never actually find the term that they're using for the research term itself. But as you go through it, it's very clear when you get to the end of what they're talking about. They're talking about hypnotic suggestion and the uses of hypnotic suggestion. And the summary of that is very interesting, or at least it's interesting to me, because they sort of sum up the meeting by saying is that, well, hypnotic suggestion could be very useful in terms of implanting and eradicating memories. So it's conceivable. They don't say they've done this, but what they're trying to do, what they were looking for, are ways in which you could use this to wipe out memories from people's minds and replace them or add false memories. And that also the idea of deconstructing personalities and creating a completely new and separate personality. So this is what this stuff is already being discussed. The whole template for what MK Ultra will be exists years before that program actually comes along. It's just a larger elaboration of this idea. But I think that gives this 49 memo gives a very good sort of roadmap of the way that they're headed. And what was particularly eerie about this to me, eerie in the sense it doesn't prove anything, but it's weird, is that I've later run across people. There are people who claim that this type of thing happens to them. They claim that my memories have been erased, and what I remember, what I think are my memories, aren't real. And usually, well, that's crazy talk. Okay. The memories I have aren't real, and my real memories have been erased, and I only get these kind of dream-like snippets of them. And this is driving me mad, which it usually does. And, they're demonstrably insane, so no one pays any attention to them. Yet, oddly, they're claiming that what was done to them is exactly what in this memo these guys are talking about doing to people. So, are those two completely unconnected things? Or is there a connection between them? You have to wonder.
It wasn't that, I mean, that was, I guess, one of the parts of, as you said, MK Ultra as a whole. I think it was called like the psychic driving stuff it was called.
Yeah.
Where
Ewan Cameron in Canada. So they farmed this out north of the border.
It wasn't this with the schizophrenic patients where they put them in a coma and
yeah, the whole idea was to essentially erase their existing crazy personality and replace it with a new, it's a psychic lobotomy. That's largely what you're aiming for. The same results you would get from a transorbital lobotomy, you would now achieve with a much more docile. The other way it's been described is the Stepford Wives experiments, since most of the patients that were used were female. So I know that some of your listeners will not like to hear this, but one of the things that apparently they decided, rightly or wrongly, that females were much more susceptible to that type of control. Which, oddly enough, notice who most of Manson's followers were, and notice other things. I mean, there are biological and physical things that we can't necessarily change about that, and call it cultural conditioning or not, but that females seem to be more accessible targets. I've also noticed that in some of the few surviving MK Ultra documents where they describe attempts to where they describe a young woman who had a fear of firearms, who's put into a hypnotic state, who was given a firearm and told to go over and shoot her friend in the head with it. And she does it. And then subsequently has no memory. So no, they weren't trying to create assassins. That was just an experiment. So that the subject in those things more often than not, tend to be female as well. So it's, I think it's fair to say that there was a lot of questionable and nefarious things which were going on, but it's all about the manipulation through hypnosis and through drugs. Psychic driving then comes, and you do these things in mental institutions because who's going to listen to anybody that complains? Right? People in an insane asylum complaining that weird things are being done to them by the doctors, who's going to believe them? It's perfect. Prisons are another place where you do it. It's not a pretty story. It is picking people who are usually have mental issues themselves, who are marginalized and vulnerable, let me pronounce that word correctly, who no one would believe if they came up with any story, and using them as lab rats. All for some sort of greater agenda. And again, this isn't something that's used, I'm not making excuses for this yet, but this, I think, was a portion of a large bureaucratic institution that was essentially set loose on this track and was not supervised and just went berserk. Or it was all part of some grand master plan. I'm not sure which, but I think you can simply explain it by the fact that these people were not being adequately supervised. And I think when we were talking last night, I mentioned the guy who's involved in the MK Ultra aspects and the dosing of unsuspecting people with LSD and other drugs, George Hunter White, who started out as a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent. And I was looking for the particular quote he had about what he did. And I think it brings so much of this stuff together where I'm going to paraphrase it from memory, but I think I'll basically get it right. And he was asked about his activities. He goes, "I was but a minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I labored mightily in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun." He goes, "Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage, all with the sanction of the all highest?" And that, I think, explains as to why people would do that. You know, it involves ego and the rest of it. You could do whatever you wanted to anyone with impunity.
Yeah, that's the name of the game, whether we like it or not. And again, I think making that distinction between things being done more likely by a very small number of people and making sure that we don't paint an entire agency or even, again, conflate that with a nation's people. They're not the same thing, and that doesn't make you a CIA apologist to say that, or any sort of apologist for any sort of...
Well, it's not the American people. The American people were the ones who were victimized by the whole thing.
Right.
We were the lab rats. Arguably, we still are. Just perhaps with more... To what extent have those techniques been more sophisticatedly applied? So the question always comes down to, when did everybody decide this was a bad idea and we're going to stop doing it? Personally, I don't think it was. Why wouldn't you continue with it? I mean, you're always told that it didn't achieve anything, didn't work. But if it did work, you couldn't admit it. Because if you said that it worked, then you would be giving away to the other side that it worked, and that would have then encouraged them. Or you say that it worked to encourage them. Remember, it's disinformation. You can claim that you performed experiments that worked simply to lull your opposition into wasting their time in that direction because they don't want you to get ahead of them. But then if you actually stumble across something that would be really important and secret, then you must keep it secret, which means denying that there was anything that was ever achieved out of it. So the ultimate thing is that while people talk about MK Ultra at the time, all the time, we have only a very limited understanding of what went on in that program, which stretched on for almost 20 years, which involved dozens of subsidiary programs investigating all kinds of things, one feeding off the other one. So what actually goes there, what the long-term legacy of that is impossible to say because you never know what happened in the first place.
Yeah, I think that goes back to, the piece of history for you that's interesting is, you're not able to arrive at these answers. And I think that's part of the reason that like that espionage is interesting to me, because a lot of it is smoke and mirrors, right? I mean, there's things like you're saying, I haven't looked into the whole remote viewing thing much, but it's the first example that came to mind. But for example, if the Americans wanted to put out this idea that remote viewing is working for us and we are stealing secrets as a result of it, is it are we stealing secrets and is it working, or is it so that, Russia and China and everybody else blows their budget and spends a bunch of time and diverts their energy into something that we know is already meaningless? So
Yeah, divert their attention and money. Could be. Or do we say that we did it for a number of years and decided that it was meaningless, when exactly the opposite is true? I mean, I've read some of you can actually go onto the CIA reading room, the public, and you can read some of these remote viewing sessions. And I fail to discern anything meaningful out of them. The one that I read was they send the person to Mars. So they project their consciousness to Mars, and they're all walking around in these different geographic locations, vaguely describing what they see and interacting with Martian ghosts. Really. And what was that useful for? It didn't really describe much of anything. So, I mean, as a story, it doesn't work particularly well, which then reasonably convinces me that this is probably an accurate description of what went on, just because it doesn't describe anything. But on the other hand, someone could argue is that particular example is out there in a public reading room just to convince you that it's all sort of meaningless. So you didn't see the other ones. Don't believe what you read. Don't believe what you hear. Then what do you believe? Nothing.
it's better than everything.
Well, it's a difficult thing to say, but it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning about believing things. And believing is something that you tend to take to heart, and then you begin to model your behavior on that. Okay, the belief affects the way that you interact with everything. So, just as an example, if nothing more, if you believe wholeheartedly in the tenets of the Roman Catholic Church, it influences your behavior. It influences the way you go about things, for better or for ill, on a daily basis. You model your life on it. And the same thing with any kind of beliefs, and that's where beliefs are powerful and to a degree dangerous, because people get ideas that they can become a kind of infectious belief that gets inside people's heads and makes them do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. I don't know. What if you decide that Jews are a race of evil aliens and a biological contamination that needs to be wiped off the face of the earth? What could possibly come from that idea? All right. Millions of dead people, an entire system of extermination which is set up, all based upon a belief that becomes weaponized. And maybe that's one of the things, is beliefs becoming weaponized. The idea that the whole world must be converted to this or that religion. I won't name one, and that it by force or otherwise, and that everyone must submit to that because this is, I believe, is God's will. I mean, you can attach that wherever you want. That tends to go everywhere. And So these things, they don't have to be harmful, but they can be. They can be very dangerous mimetic infections that can infect entire populations and lead to holocausts of unimaginable consequence.
Okay, so moving on to the back nine here. Maybe let's start with the Bohemian Club.
Okay, so I'm glad you said Bohemian Club instead of Bohemian Grove. Everybody talks about Bohemian Grove. That's just the place where the Bohemian Club meets. So, because that's where you see them. Bohemian Club is a rich man's club. Okay, you have to be. I guess you could be poor, and that they let you in because it is a secret society, which means that it's selective of its membership. So, and here again, we need a definition, perhaps. Secret society. Does that mean nobody knows about it? No, everybody knows about the Freemasons. Okay, they're a society with secrets. But a secret society, the secret part is usually what goes on within the organization, its tenets, its practices, its internal beliefs, usually not the existence of it. So the Bohemian Club is a secret society that does not disguise its existence. It's headquartered in San Francisco. Early on, wealthy members bought a 2,700-acre plot of land north of the city, up in the redwoods, and that's where they built a summer retreat, and that's where they hold their kind of summer camp every summer for the members and guests, which are invited. So there are both the members of the club and people who are invited as guests. It is still an all-male organization. I have been told that busloads of hookers are brought in during that, but that's a story. Makes sense. And it started out as, I guess one of the questions is, why is it called the Bohemian Club? And I think there are two potential explanations for that may be combined. A lot of the founding members were journalists. And since journalists, and this is in the 1870s, around 1875, journalists were often mobile. They moved from one job to another. Bohemian was then being a kind of term that was similar to gypsy, meant people who moved around from one place to another. But the initial members were generally artsy types, musicians, writers, journalists, some local businessmen, but it didn't really start out as a rich guy's club. And started out as more a kind of journal, artsy-fartsy type of organization. But it gained a certain amount of currency and prestige. And once something has prestige, people who have money without prestige want things that have prestige. Nothing like the nouveau riche to go hunting for anything they can. So over time, its membership became increasingly well-heeled, and then around the 1920s and 1930s also became increasingly political. And usually some people later argued that had to do with when Herbert Hoover, around just before and by the time he became president, became a member, that Hoover made it more political than it had been previously. But the whole idea was to get together, it was a men's club that would often try to isolate themselves, to have fun. And that's supposedly what the summer camp is all about. It's just a lot of guys. True, they may be wealthy and powerful, but nevertheless, they just want to get off into the woods and put on some costumes and stage fake pagan rituals in front of a lake and a giant stone owl that talks to them. And have a mock human sacrifice, but there's nothing funny going on here. And they have cabins with different names. It's a summer camp. It's exactly what it's like, just for older rich guys. And weaving spiders come not here is kind of the motto, which means we're not supposed to talk. Well, supposedly it means we're not supposed to talk about business. We're trying to get away from business. We're important people. We have weighty decisions to make. And we want to come out to the woods, and we want to have fun, and we don't want to have to do it. But, you're never going to escape that. You bring together businessmen, whoever it may be, people who make weighty decisions, and you can put them in all the robes you want to and stage all the skits you want, and they're still going to end up talking about business. That's just inevitable. Whether or not that's the plan, that's going to happen. So a lot of attention is focused on the cremation of care ritual, which came along pretty early. There were versions of it maybe by 1880 or so. And that's the original, people have snuck in and filmed this, and this is where people are in robes. They have a whole orchestra there. I don't know where those people come from. I don't think those are club members playing all those instruments, but there's musical accompaniment. The owl, which is supposedly built out of the same material that the Matterhorn in Disneyland is made out of, even designed by the same person, because it looks like real rock, right? And has a booming voice. So there's this, it's a whole sort of conversation between the two, and it's the cremation of care. And dull care is usually a kind of wicker effigy, which is supposed to represent, well, all of your dull care, all of your concerns, and all of that stupid business that you have to deal with. And we're going to open the ceremony by coming out, having guys row across the lake, place dull care at the foot of the owl, and then burning it. So it's a mock human sacrifice. Probably. No, we'll assume that it is. Even they couldn't get away with that, could they? So, but that's what draws most of the attention, because you get guys in druid-like robes and what looks like a weird, even mock human sacrifices are, well, let's face it, kind of creepy. Now, the explanation you would get from insiders is that, look, this is just play acting, and it's just a dramatic performance which is put on, and there are a whole series of plays, and every cabin is supposed to perform its own little skit as time goes on, and it's just all for fun and games. That's it. There's nothing more serious to it than that. In fact, it's the exact opposite of serious. None of it is meant to be taken seriously. Now, those of us on the outside can sometimes find that hard to believe, because we just basically believe that when rich guys get together, especially in robes, that there's something funny going on. Well, there could be. I mean, here you got different explanations for it. You see what you see. The cremation of care ritual is not imaginary, it's real. It depends upon what meaning you want to apply to that. Is this something which is nefarious, or is it something which is harmless? Just kind of looks funny to outsiders. The more important part of that to me isn't the robed rituals, but the lakeside talks. So sometimes people are invited to come and give talks, which sounds suspiciously like business talks, usually on matters of policy or some kind of interest to those who are assembled. Now, supposedly these are just informative, but one guy who had a particular perspective on that was Richard Nixon. And when in the late 60s, Nixon was trying to revive his political career and was looking again to run for president in 68, he was invited to give a lakeside talk at Bohemian Grove. He was not a member of the organization, so he's invited there. But what Nixon perceived, was that he was being vetted for his presidential run, and he apparently passed. And he regarded that as the critical step on the renewal of his political career and his achievement of the presidency, because he was being auditioned for this role. The people who had the money to fund his campaign wanted to see what he looked and sounded like. He thought that the whole thing going on there was completely ridiculous. He had no particular sympathy for the club or anything else. But he knew, he was a politician, and he knew that important people who had money were willing to listen to him, and so he came and talked to them. And he's certainly not the first person who has done that. So that, again, besides the theatrical rituals, is probably the more important type of thing that takes place. So, the Bohemian Club is full of people who are wealthy and influential, and it's not too surprising that they congregate together. Are things decided or discussed there that later go out and become part of corporate or government policy? Sure they do. But if it's not there, it's going to be somewhere else.
Might as well be in a boardroom. Same thing.
Might as well, yeah.
Without the mock human sacrifice, I guess, right? But haven't there been presidents that have actually been members, not just speakers?
Oh, Herbert Hoover was one. Calvin Coolidge might have been. I'm sure there have been others as well. I mean, I've seen various remember, it's a private organization. So getting membership lists from private organizations is, they don't have to give you any information at all. But it's usually a smattering. Early on, it was pretty heavily sort of West Coast capitalists and entrepreneurs. More political figures do seem to get involved by the 30s or 40s. And it's now pretty much a mixture of the two.
So I could, there's things like the cremation of care. I could understand wanting to let go of all your shit for a couple days. So things like that, things like Burning Man, which again is a music festival, but they set art sculptures on fire just as a symbolic kind of burning of your inhibitions and, whatever you want to let go of. So I can understand that. But isn't there also a part of it where they worship the owl as a god? It's Moloch is the name of it, right?
Well, Moloch's been attached to it, but I can't find any place in the historical Moloch where it appears as an owl. Moloch is usually a kind of brazen image where you incinerate babies. All right.
Oh.
You would sacrifice. That comes from the old Phoenician religion, which was practiced by the Israelites for a while. It was quite a fashion that way. Sometimes called, I think, mistakenly the Canaanite religion, but it comes out. It was practiced in Carthage as well. It's usually a large brazen image, more commonly of a bull, and you would light a large fire, and then the thing that became common in Carthage was usually to sacrifice the firstborn. Now, there was a reason for that. And not to make an excuse for it, but to try to explain what they were doing, is that life is hazardous and infant mortality was very high. Okay, so one of the things that was a truism through most of human history is that most of the children that were born would die before they reached adulthood. So the idea was that if you sacrificed the firstborn or one of the child to the god would protect the others, because you're going to have numerous children. And so one would be sacrificed to gain protection for the others. So it was seen as a deal which was made, for which there was an advantage. But I don't know whether the owl shows up in different ways, but I don't see any connection between Moloch, that term which was used, and an owl. And I'm not really sure how those two things became conflated. Now, the owl is the symbol of the Bohemian Club itself. So if you go to its headquarters in San Francisco, there's a little owl on the outside of that. Now, here's one of the things I do find interesting. What other secret society had an owl almost identical to the one on the Bohemian Club, not the statue, as its emblem? The Bavarian Illuminati. And because the owl is the totem animal of Athena, or Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. Now, you have to be careful what you make out of that, because all owls pretty much look alike, don't they? I mean, some are bigger or smaller, but an owl is an owl is an owl, especially as is portrayed in art. So it doesn't mean that the owl on the Bohemian Club is copied from the owl, which was the emblem of the Bavarian Illuminati, but it is interesting that they're the same and they look quite similar. But those have been used by other organizations as well. Now, I said earlier that besides the Bohemian Club being named after journalists, sort of transient journalists, bohemians, there was a little known but rather large secret society which was German in origin called Schlaraffia. Schlaraffia had been formed, guess where? In Bohemia, what's now the Czech Republic, in Prague. It was primarily German and spread by German immigrant communities all around the world. And it was a mockery of Freemasonry. So Freemasonry was probably the largest of the secret fraternal orders, but it was also a little high class for a lot of people. It tended to cater to the well-to-do, it tended to exclude farmers, poor people, working men, and the rest of it. And so you would have people who would form societies that were based on Freemasonry, but also mocked it to a degree. So that's one of the and now the interesting is Schlaraffia began largely among artists, actors and artists, other people in the arts, much as with the Bohemian Club in San Francisco, and which had an owl as its totem animal. There's usually a statue of an owl in what they call castles. That was their name for their lodge. And there was a fairly large Schlaraffia province is what they call part of it, but presence in San Francisco. There was a German immigrant community there, and they brought Schlaraffia with them. What I tend to think is that I think the Bohemian Club was an anglicized version of Schlaraffia. I think they copied certain things from that. And along with the kind of theatricality of the robes and the rituals that we used. I haven't run across anything that would show that there was a counterpart to the cremation of care in Schlaraffia, but I think that's where it came together. It was a blending of Schlaraffia, maybe older traditions, who knows? Maybe the Bavarian Illuminati figured in there in some way. But usually you'll find that these things have a kind of polyglot origin.
What about the Skull and Bone Society at Yale? I think there's it's probably most publicized during the presidential race between John Kerry and George W. Bush, because they were both members, and I think both refused to talk about it. But there's the rumored initiation that I've heard, at least, is pretty interesting. So I don't know what you've.
Well, everything about it is secret. So unless you're in it, you don't know. And I think in a kind of disinformation that some of these groups will spread these stories as a way of creating a bigger mythology about themselves. Always beware of information that you can't confirm, because half the time it will be disinformation. So Skull and Bones is a senior society at Yale. Lots of universities have senior societies. They're not exactly fraternities. You don't join. You're only in it in your senior year. You're recruited or chosen. The thing about a secret society is you must be chosen. They're selective in terms of their membership. There's some criteria by which they choose people. That's one of the secrets. So at the end of your junior year, you're selected. There are only 15 people at any given time. I think until the 1990s, it was all male. It now is coeducational. And usually members would be selected from different areas. One of the things you often find in secret society recruitment is like-mindedness. Some groups want to recruit people who are like internet forums where everybody thinks the same. But Skull and Bones seem to have gone out of its way to recruit people. So there would be, a lefty, a person on the right, someone who was a jock, someone who was more intellectual, and different areas in the arts and the sciences. And there was a reason behind that, because the society wanted to spread its influence into as many areas as possible. So you didn't just concentrate on one area. So across political parties and ideologies, across disciplines and careers, so that you would find eventually bonesmen embedded in as many institutions and area as possible, which is an interesting strategy. But that's deliberate. And it's not because they're being democratic. It's because they want to extend their influence. And that's the way that you do it. So it's also only one of at least a dozen senior societies that are at Yale. And a lot of other universities, mostly in the East, have those. You can find them elsewhere if you look. They don't get any press, though. Nobody pays any attention to them. And so Skull and Bones is gotten a lot of press because, again, it has presidential candidates who are part of it. It's received notoriety that the other societies, Keel and Key and Scroll, Wolf's Head, a whole variety of them, don't have. They're actually, in some places, there are a couple of all-female versions of these senior societies as well. So nobody pays much attention to them. So what are they supposed to do? Well, the Bush family has played a prominent role. A lot of the membership tends to be multi-generational, hereditary. If you come from a family, you're more likely to be recruited. And they're supposed to have a particular affection for collecting skulls. So supposedly they're rumored to have Geronimo's skull, which Prescott Bush and some others are supposed to have gone up and dug up from his grave. And his skull is apparently missing. Whether or not it's in the tomb, which is their little clubhouse, well, they're not going to admit, because it's a private institution. They don't have to admit anything. So the initiation usually involves the person going in, lying in a coffin, and talking about all of their innermost personal desires and secrets. You have to create a kind of biography, and it tends to have supposedly heavy emphasis on sex. Okay, what sort of things you've done, what sort of kinks you're interested in. The type of stuff that Jeffrey Epstein might be interested in, or Mossad, who knows. So you have to compromisable material. So that, again, makes sort of sense organizationally. Stuff that could be used against the person should they ever betray. So we're going to impart our secrets to you. You must give your secrets to us. Now, another interesting thing about that practice is that here again, the Bavarian Illuminati sort of raises its head, because in the description of their initiation rituals, there's something almost identical to that. I don't recall that it involved lying in a coffin. That seems to be taken from Freemasonry. Skulls and coffins in Freemasonry, and in the Odd Fellows too. And those are all for the reenactment of the different rituals, and part of this always has to do with a kind of mock death and resurrection, where coffins play a prop role. But the Bavarian Illuminati also required that all initiates had to give a detailed personal history with all of their kinks that were involved in it. So it's not like that only could be thought of in one circumstance. But it makes an interesting connection with the allegation that's been around for some time that Skull and Bones is simply the American import of the Bavarian Illuminati, which admitted by its founders, Alonzo Taft and whoever the other fellow, Russell, that they borrowed this, that they adopted the whole thing. They went on an exchange to Germany, and they modeled it on a German university secret society. So that's what its founders argue it was. And they also give it the number 322. No one is quite sure what that stands for. Some thinks it has to do with the date of the death of Demosthenes. Others think that it's Lodge 322 of the Illuminati. I mean, you can make out of it what it may mean nothing. Or it may have some other kind of it has a Pythagorean value based upon a kind of number mysticism. So, it's possible. I wouldn't wholly... the Bavarian Illuminati is a real thing. That's a real organization, actually existed, never really went out of existence. It just kind of fades or becomes something else. Was also very adept at penetrating other organizations and disguising its activities behind, let's say, a Masonic lodge or some other group that wouldn't create suspicion. So it's possible. I don't know that you can say that you can't present it as a fact, but the idea that it was brought over in the early 19th century from Germany, supposedly modeled on a German organization, it wouldn't surprise me if there wasn't some connection between them. And they have a private island, where they hold annual meetings and getaways. So, similar type of thing.
You don't say. Again, I don't know how much merit there is to it, but have you heard the initiation that I was talking about? That sounds more likely rooted in reality than this one. But the one that I heard was about you get in the coffin and they do some homosexual things to you. And it's essentially just a blackmail ritual.
Yeah, that again would be the common theme in both of those is the way that you give them compromisable material. Although what you voluntarily would give would probably hold more weight than what was forcibly done to you. And you can always claim, I was a victim. Okay, I didn't do any part of that. But then who knows what you said? All right. These are supposedly actions or statements that take place in secrecy among a secret group who then everybody can say anything they want about this. So there would have to be more to your confession than simply your statement for it to be really useful. That would have to be connected to something else. There would have to be some kind of evidence. So if you admitted killing someone, they'd have to be able to produce the body. Doesn't mean anything unless you can do that. But yeah, that's another one of those things that can be interpreted as just kind of, ritualistic fun and games. It's a frat party prank. Doesn't really mean much of anything, or it means everything. But here again, it comes down to what you believe about it, how seriously you want to take something. I mean, people can attend the same sort of event or same sort of ritual and not take it seriously at all. It's just some goofy thing that we're doing. But for other people, this could be a religious experience. And they will then begin to act upon that belief.
Okay, so let's wrap up secret societies with the Bilderbergs or the Bilderbergers and the Bilderberg meeting. I'm not sure what the correct.
Well, this is an organization that has no actual name because Bilderberg simply is the name of the hotel where they had their first meeting, I think in 53 or 54. And then every year they meet at another fancy hotel. But that was it. It was the Bilderberg or Bilderberger Hotel in the Netherlands. And that's what it's been called ever since. Which doesn't tell you what the name of the organization has, if it has a name. And maybe it doesn't have to. Or maybe it does. Here again, I go back to Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Bavarian Illuminati, who said, never let our order be known anywhere under its real name. So even the Illuminati is not what it's actually called. That just means we're illuminated. We have special knowledge. So what is it really? No one ever utters that. So I wouldn't draw too much from that, but so the name tells you nothing. It simply tells you the name of the hotel where they had their first meeting. The interesting thing about, and it brings together a relatively small group of people, mostly from government, finance, sometimes the arts, but mostly media, journalism, but now media. And that's people of influence, influencers. People who hold political office, who run companies, who control money, who influence the news. And they get together to discuss things. That's all they do. They discuss certain points. What they discuss is secret. So even if you're a member of the news media and you were invited there, you are never supposed to talk about what is discussed. But you just talk about things and then you go back to act upon what you talked about. Well, nobody says that either. It's just all informational. It's closely connected to the idea of Atlanticism and the Western Alliance. It's a kind of adjunct to NATO in the same way. It seems to me to be the kind of civil component to what's called the Pinay Circle or Les Cercle, which is more of a military organization, started by a French general by the name of Pinay. So it's sometimes called the Pinay Circle. That has to deal more with military policy. The Bilderberger meetings seem to have to do with financial and civil policy. Somewhere, I think at the first meeting, there were about 50 people who attended. Today, somewhere between about 100 and 150 is always by invitation. Some people go multiple years. Some people go only once. Those people are not the organization. They're the invitees. So what's the organization? It's the steering committee. The steering committee consists of an unknown group of people that's probably about 20, but no one knows exactly. Who the steering members are isn't clear. And then there's a kind of general director. And so here's the really interesting part to me, is the guy who sets the whole thing into motion. Who created Bilderberger? It's a fellow by the name of Josef Rettinger. He was Polish. The name sounds German, but he was Polish, presumably. And in his early career, from around World War I up through World War II, was an international gadfly political conspirator in one form or another. Seemingly of a kind of leftist persuasion, active everywhere from Europe to Mexico. So, for instance, in the 30s, he was very much involved in the Mexican labor movement. And he never holds political office. He advises politicians. There was a biography written about him called Eminence Grise, Gray Eminence, which is what he's one of these people who, and if you look around, you can find them. They're always next to power, but they never formally hold power themselves. Henry Kissinger was that way for a long time. Still, never held elective office in any form, was appointed to different positions, was always an advisor, someone who would give counsel to people. That's what he spent his whole life doing in many ways. So Rettinger at various times had been expelled from France during World War I for political conspiracy. Nobody says what that was. He was kicked out of the U.S. for illegal movement from Mexico, I think in the 20s. He was also expelled from Britain at one point. And during World War II, he ends up involved with the Polish government in exile as an advisor to General Sikorsky, who later dies in a suspicious plane crash. And then after the war, Rettinger is involved again with this kind of NATO, Western Alliance, Atlanticist group and sets this. And he goes to a guy, he knows he needs a front man. And the front man he finds is Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who I think will remain the general director or general secretary of it all the way up to 1975. And Prince Bernhard is interesting, is that he's not Dutch, he's German. And during the 30s, he had apparently been a quite enthusiastic Nazi, but then married into the Dutch royal family and then ends World War II as a hero of the Dutch resistance. It's another one of these people you find whose politics just seem to vary whichever way is most advantageous to them. They seem to have no real convictions of their own, but they'll assume whatever sort of clothing is convenient for the time and place. But Prince Bernhard is the front man. Rettinger is the guy who creates the whole thing. And I think up until his death in the 60s really is the saying that he seems to determine who comes. I mean, one idea is that there is no steering committee at that time. There's just Rettinger. And he would sort of assemble these groups of people he wanted to bring there to be exposed to certain ideas, to discuss certain questions, and then go back to their home countries to influence policy. Just gives advice.
That's all.
That's all. Nothing to see here.
So do they sign NDAs or is it just a handshake?
My impression is that it's just a verbal agreement that you give. So how do you enforce that agreement? Well, you don't get invited back, I assume, but nobody much seems to break it. I can't think of anyone, there's probably an exception to it somewhere, who was invited to a Bilderberg meeting who then went and spilled their guts about what was talked about. I mean, most of it has to do with what could be called sort of Western financial and governmental policies. And now the mythology about it is that this is where political leadership is determined. So, you invite Bill Clinton or someone there, and they get the nod. And that kind of echoes Nixon's experience at Bohemian Grove. And I'm certain he's not the only one who has done that. And it wouldn't surprise me. Why would it surprise you that takes place? Remember we said at the beginning about one of the basic rules of the reason why conspiracy exists is to limit the number of decision makers? You can't have everybody making these kind of decisions. Thank God, when you want to let everybody vote on things. So, no, these decisions all have to be made. What people get to vote on in mass is presented to them. I think this is why things like state legislatures and otherwise get so upset over the sort of popular petitions, the idea that you can put something on the ballot, the kind of mass legislation, the initiatives. There you go. I know that's an issue in my home state of Idaho, where there was an effort by the legislature to sort of place greater limitations on creating initiative measures to make it harder to get things on the ballot, because that's what the legislature is supposed to do. And it just lets people make up laws on their own, which you can't let them do. So that's kind of an odd thing that I've noticed, that for many of the people who tend to tout the idea of democracy, nothing seems to frighten them more than actually just letting people just go wild ass voting on things. So you can't have that. You can't actually, we trust in the wisdom of the people, except when it's not, so managing things in a way. So that's what you can think of. You can think of all of your legislatures and Congress as a conspiracy against the public, organized so there's only a small group of vetted people funded by the right people who will make the actual decisions. So you get to vote for this one, or you get to vote for that one, but not, and you can vote for other ones, but they'll never get there. So there's the choices you have. That's it.
So let's wrap up with some cults or the occult.
Occultism is essentially a kind of religious practice. I mean, all religions are a form of occultism. So, okay, we have to define that, right? What are you talking about in terms of the occult? The occult is properly thought of as anything sort of usually satanic, weird, creepy, involving ghosts and the paranormal, all of this type of stuff, which is not really what it's about. Occult means hidden. And the basic concept is that there is a much wider hidden world than the one that we experience. But that we live in a much bigger universe, which we can only actually deal with and access through certain ritualized or special ritual procedures, a mental approach, trance states, that they're all the stuff that we can't see and that we can't hear, that your dog can. So one of those I would put it is that if you have a dog or a cat, a parrot probably, they exist beside you. They live in your house and everything seems the same, but they're actually living in a different reality than you are. So if it's a dog, you're dealing with a dog, you have a much more vivid vision than they do. You can see all kinds of colors that they can't. They, on the other hand, can smell all kinds of things that you can't and hear things that you can't. And their time actually runs slower. So apparently dogs and cats operate at about their mental refresh rate is about 2/3 of ours. So to them, the world is sort of just blue and yellow, and they have cataracts, okay, because they don't have the same visual acuity that we do. So visually, everything is kind of dull and hazy, but it's very vivid in terms of smells and sounds, and it runs at a slower pace. It's like everyone is playing the record at 2/3 speed. So their reality is not a fake reality. It's their reality. That's exactly the way the universe works to them. And it works, we're sitting 6 inches away from the couch, are experiencing a different reality. It's real. It isn't like one is valid and the other is invalid. They're both perfectly and absolutely true at the same time, but different. Woo-woo. So occultism postulates that there's this wider world, and this wider universe is inhabited, and there are various intelligences, call them demons, spirits, angels, whatever you want to, that are there, which through techniques, occultism, we can connect with and communicate with and gain powers or information that's otherwise not available to us. That's all hypothetical. That's the operative theory within occultism. And the ism part of it are all of those practices and beliefs that are used to do this. And that can involve everything from alchemy, which is the manipulation of things, to theurgy, which is the invocation of gods or other higher spirits. It can involve mental states, trances. It can involve elaborate rituals. But what it all comes down to, the essence of it, in my estimation, is the effort to use this larger reality to bend and influence this one. So it's based on the concept that reality is malleable. It's not fixed. So it's similar to, this idea that when you break things down to the atomic or subatomic levels, there's really nothing there. There's no physical substance to the universe anymore. There's the possibility of things existing as opposed to them. So it's almost as if you go from this realm of infinite possibility, all that could potentially exist exists as possibilities, which then somehow gradually manifests into the solid world that we live in. This is why in things like the CIA-funded paranormal experience in the 80s, you'd have people trying to put their hands through walls or something because there's nothing there. Or there's nothing in your hand either. So it's the basic concept that first, reality is something from nothing. It's not real. It's an illusion. You ever heard the people running around saying that the universe is a hologram? Or that we're living in some sort of it's just the recycling of this idea. So occultism for millennia has been teaching the same thing, that what appears to be a solid, rock-hard reality is a kind of illusion, a kind of collective illusion. It's something which is only a subset of something which is much larger and which is malleable in terms of influencing the way it will go or influencing the way it was. So to bring us back for a second time to Aleister Crowley, Crowley's statement was that magic, which is the sort of main operative means of occultism, is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. So it's not uncommon today to hear people talk about manifesting things. Like every time I turn around, somebody's manifesting this, they're manifesting that. Well, that's magic, my friends. That's what it is. That's exactly what Crowley was talking about. Manifesting it, thinking about it, visualizing it, writing it down X number of times, going through these ritual procedures, is all in an effort to bend reality to your will. to create the reality that you want. That is the fundamental element of occultism, to change reality. So if you can do that on an individual basis, the idea is that you can do it on a kind of collective basis. You could theoretically organize vast mass rituals that people don't even realize are rituals, in which they all focus their intention. The other thing which is key in this is intent. Everything is about intent. That's the will that Crowley's talking about, the intention that you want to have, which is more than just holding your hands and wishing really, really hard about something, but that's a kind of mockery of it. Now, the question is, can you do that? Again, say for thousands of years, people believe that they can. And I would assume that they don't keep doing the same thing over and over again if it never works. I don't know. It's never worked for me that I can tell, or maybe it has. You never know what you might get. But that's where something like ritual comes in, where you get a lot of people together and you focus their intent and their energy on producing a particular outcome. Simple, somewhat silly example, but an illustrative one, is a high school pep rally. The goal here is victory over the opposing team. You gather everyone together into the temple, the gymnasium. And there you arouse them with music, dancing virgins, people prancing around, theoretically, prancing around in animal totem costumes, and you try to get people as worked up as you possibly can, and you have them doing chants and singing songs all about how the opponents will be defeated and you will be victorious. You are attempting to manifest the victory that you want to achieve. Now, across town, the opposing team is holding a counter ritual, which, may... So whoever is more enthusiastic, this is where you can get people who get pissed off at you if you're not into the pep rally, because it's all because of your bad attitude that our team is going to lose. So, but that's a very simple form of kind of group ritual magic in practice, the manifestation of a reality. The key thing in this, I think, is the whole idea that you can, in theory, manipulate this. So you just got to entertain that idea for a minute, that through mass or even individually, through the focusing of will, through the kind of taking control of your reality or the reality around you, you can change it. Here's a way to think about it. You ever had a dream where you realize it's a dream?
Lucid dream?
A lucid dream. That can mean different things. Sometimes it can mean you're kind of half asleep, but the other one's where you're dreaming and you just realize that this is a dream. And once you realize it's a dream, well, you either wake up or you realize that you can just change whatever is happening in the dream. If there's something that you don't like, you can just, there's some sort of obstacle you had in the dream. That obstacle just goes away. You can begin to manipulate the reality of the dream. So an extension of that would be that this reality that we live in, our waking world, is just another type of dream. And that the practices of occultism, or certain of those, can then make you aware of how you can turn this into the same equivalent of, let's say, an ordinary dream by taking control of what's going on. That you can then begin to change those events by application of will, which is a rather astounding, seemingly impossible, but also very spooky idea. But people, again, have always seemed, or some people, convinced that they can do that. And it's a thing that we keep trying to do in a number of different ways. So here's an interesting argument. Let's suppose that you can, with the proper techniques and proper conditioning, begin to change things just ever so slightly in a particular way. Or as one person put it, what you're trying to do here is just tilt the luck plane just a little bit. So you have to think of it, everything is kind of on an equilibrium. And you're just trying to put enough pressure on one side so that you tilt it just a little bit. And you've got a marble sitting in the middle of that table. Now, if you tilt it ever so slightly, the marble will begin to roll to that side. Doesn't matter how small the tilt may be, it will begin to roll. Gravity will inexorably carry it over to that side. And that's all you have to do. You don't have to make some big change. You just have to tilt the luck plane ever so slightly in the favor of the outcome that you want to have. And that has been said, not what is, but what has been said. That is the secret that elites or specialized groups or some secret societies know how to accomplish that end and are constantly using their influence and their power to do so. On the other hand, other arguments that they're being opposed by other groups who are trying to tilt the luck plane in the other direction from that one so that they're constantly battling back and forth, which I guess neutralizes much of what's going on. So, leaving aside the unprovable, probably, idea as to whether or not such a thing can be accomplished, what is undeniable is that there have always been and still are people who believe it can be done. And remember, once people believe things, they will doggedly attempt to, that's what it is. Belief is an attempt to manifest a particular reality. And it even sort of becomes the reality. You know, when you start deciding one group of people are evil and then you start exterminating them, you are creating that reality. The belief is no longer just some sort of abstract idea held by goofy people, but instead it's something which becomes real. So don't say that can't happen. Ideas can manifest themselves in that way. So that's what's really going on when, behind a lot of the robes and the rituals and all of the other, most of the time, frankly, it's just people playing at it, but some people take it very seriously. And the results that they obtain, who knows?
Well, I guess on one end of the scale, you have a pep rally, and then on the other end, or spectrum rather, you have people doing human sacrifices to
giant owls.
Right.
Yeah. But is it all for show, or is there a particular purpose in that? And, well, sacrifice always plays a part in this, because the other idea is you don't get something for nothing. There's always. So if you're making deals with whatever you want to describe them as, angels, demons, spirits, they're not doing this out of the kindness of their hearts, usually. So, what can you offer? What are you willing to pay? The classic story in this is the Faustian bargain. And this is, how do you obtain success in the world? Well, hard work, perseverance. And yet, it's not too hard to look around you and find people who work hard and they never get anywhere. It always necessitates something else. There always has to be an element of luck, fortune, circumstance. You never do it just entirely on your own, because you can be smart, work hard, apply yourself, and you can still fail. That is not a guarantor of success. And then other people seem to make no particular effort, and they succeed. Now, is that because they sold their soul to the devil? Could be. That's what we might suspect, believe. But there is that element. And you don't know until you try it, which I'm not advising that anybody would do. But, you can. And I think in the first episode of the Secrets of the Occult series I did for Great Courses, that was because I knew what people might think about this. And I was saying, well, are we going to learn how to sell our souls to the devil? Okay. No, I'm not going to teach you how to do that. But at the end, I said, it's very simple. You don't have to go through a ritual to do that. It doesn't require that. It just requires your willingness to do so. all you have to do at any particular point in time is go, yeah, deal is done. No books, no signatures in blood, nothing else. That's just all stage dressing. It's like stage magic as opposed to real magic. Stage magic is a demonstration of the public. Real magic doesn't really appear. Its results appear, but not necessarily the magic itself. But, people try that. There's a reason why the Faust story is so popular and so eternal, because it's a shortcut to success, but as we all know how the story turns out, there's always a price to be paid. Success is not eternal. Only your soul is.
Yeah.
Which you just sold, by the way. So it's a whole set of beliefs, and there's a kind of mindset that goes with it. There are different ways. I'm not sure I'd call it an occult mindset, but the other thing, if you sort of venture into that realm, that you have to think of, you have to start thinking about, is that nothing that happens is an accident. Everything is an omen. Everything that happens, and in an omen, in the sense that it's a kind of segue to something else. It means something. So you can try this sometime, if you want to. You can just try going that everything, you get up in the morning, everything that's going to happen to you during that day is significant, no matter how small it might be. So if you drop the toothpaste, whatever it is, you have to examine every single action. You have to look at everything which is going on around you. So you have to think in the sense that you and the wider invisible world and the visible world are constantly engaged in a conversation. So things are constantly talking to you. You're just not listening. So you have to pay attention to how this bird flies over, what sort of animals appear, everything that happens. And you always have to look at this, is that it's a kind of predictor of what's coming. Not necessarily what will be, but what might be. Because those things can be changed depending upon your particular actions. Now, in the spirit of experimentation, I've tried that on occasion, and it's exhausting. Okay, and you can't concentrate on anything. I mean, you have to get it, but it's distracting. It also leads to a kind of a state of paranoia, because it also entails that everything you do is being watched and somehow evaluated. It's like you're going around with a camera on you, on which you are pretty much. So, but there are other people who can kind of get into that on a daily basis and live their lives that way. That is this constant realm of significance, even in the most trivial things. So, here's the question. In doing so, do you become enlightened or do you go mad? And what's the difference between the two?
That seems like a good place to end it.
All right.
You guys decide the answer to that question. But anyway,
Yes.
man, this is awesome. I could sit here and talk to you all day. We've covered a ton of ground today, and I think the listeners are really going to enjoy it as well. But yeah, man, your work is fascinating. You are fascinating. Thank you for coming out here again. And
Thanks
tell
for
people
having me.
where they can find you if they want to look your work up.
Well, if you want to, the main place to look would probably be the Great Courses. Just Google that in, and you can find Real History of Secret Societies, Crimes of the Century, which just deals, thankfully, just with murders, and Secrets of the Occult. I will have another series coming out in about 6 months or so called Great Villains of History. And you can find my books, one on Aleister Crowley, one on Sidney Riley, one on Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, which just deals with financial intrigue. Those are all available on Amazon or wherever books are sold these days. And I also, with a friend of mine, have a podcast, our little minor foray into that, called Strange as It Seems Podcast, available on YouTube and other platforms. And we talk about things like this and other stuff as well, so you can check that out.
Yes, I will link it in the description below. But yeah, thank you again, man. This is awesome. Let's get you to the airport.
Okay.
Boom. What's up, guys? Thank you so much for taking the time to watch the interview. If you got anything out of this video at all, please like the video, leave me a comment, tell me what you thought of the video, tell me who you'd like to see on the show. I really appreciate the support. It goes a long way on these platforms, as you guys know. Most importantly, I have some excellent interviews coming up in the future that I'm really, really excited about. So please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of them. But that's it. Thank you for your support. I really appreciate it, and hope to see you again soon.